Everything began in the middle of a merciless war, on a battlefield so ruined that the earth itself seemed buried beneath corpses and broken weapons. At the very heart of that slaughter, a man staggered violently and coughed out a heavy burst of blood, his body shaking from a blow that should have killed him on the spot. The sacred sword of the knightly order had struck its target cleanly, piercing straight through him and sinking deep into the center of his chest. The moment the soldiers saw it, their exhausted voices exploded into cheers, filled with the trembling relief of men who believed the nightmare before them had finally been defeated. The man collapsing in the blood-stained dirt was feared across the land as the demon of the continent, Asha'man. He was the strongest necromancer the world had ever known, a monster whose name alone had haunted countless battlefields. As the last of his life began to drain from his body, the mage understood with bitter clarity that his time had finally run out. For 10 brutal years, this war had spread like a disease across the continent, reaching every nation and every corner of the land. Even now, Asha'man had tried to reinforce his defenses against this final attack. But when the decisive moment came, all of his spells, all of his preparations, and all of his power had still failed to save him. His gaze drifted toward the pile of skulls beside him, and in that grim sight, he quietly accepted that this was a complete and flawless defeat. And the one who had brought him to this end was the lone knight standing before him, Burkle Rhineland. Yet the commander of the knights did not raise his head in pride or claim this victory as his own. With a voice weighed down by grief, Burkle said that this triumph had never belonged to one man. Countless lives had been thrown into the fire of war, and countless people had died just so his sword could finally reach Asha'man. Then Burkle pleaded with the Archmage to surrender at last, begging him to stop for the sake of peace and for the ordinary people who had suffered long enough. But those words only poured fuel onto Asha'man's hatred. His face twisted with fury as he let out a broken, ragged scream and told the knight to shut his mouth. With poison dripping from every word, Asha'man accused the knights of doing nothing while plague tore through the innocent. In his eyes, these so-called holy warriors were not saviors at all, but creatures even lower than beasts. And at the end of that furious outburst, he spat out his final condemnation, calling every last one of them nothing but pathetic hypocrites. Then, without warning, a sickly green aura began to throb around Asha'man's battered body as he forced his wounded legs beneath him and rose once more. The soldiers froze in horror, unable to believe that even with his heart shattered and his body pierced, he still had enough strength left to command necromancy. His comrades cried out in alarm, warning Burkle of the danger, but the knight only stood firm and ordered the mage to put an end to this madness. Burkle then revealed the terrible cost of the war, saying that 20 million people had already died, only to be dragged back from death as puppets in the necromancer's army. Asha'man's expression remained cold and unmoved, and instead of showing remorse, he sneered at the knight as though Burkle were too foolish to understand anything. Then Burkle struck at the wound buried deepest inside him, accusing Asha'man of being driven by nothing more than a twisted hunger for revenge over the people he had lost. The necromancer challenged him to say that he was wrong, and for one heavy moment, Burkle could only fall silent beneath the weight of that question. At last, the knight revealed the true reason he had fought his way to this battlefield. He fixed his unwavering eyes on Asha'man, and as his grip tightened around the sword, its blade began to shine with a brilliant light. He declared that everything he had done, every battle fought, and every drop of blood spilled, had been for the future of the children who would inherit this world. The instant those words reached him, Asha'man's entire body went still, as if something inside him had been struck harder than any blade ever could. Burkle spoke of leaving hope behind for the next generation, of making sure the world they received was not only ashes, corpses, and hatred. And in that single moment, Asha'man saw something that shattered what remained of him. Reflected in Burkle's eyes was his own corrupted and twisted form, a monster soaked in blood and death. But beneath that reflection, he caught a glimpse of something far older and far more painful. He saw the clear, justice-filled eyes of the knight he had once been, a man who looked nothing like the creature he had allowed himself to become. As Burkle readied his final strike, thinking of the descendants who would live on after them, Asha'man was swallowed by shock. The strength left his body all at once, and he finally dropped to his knees in the dirt. Burkle lifted his sword high above him, preparing to bring down the final blow that would close the age of the continent's demon forever. At last, the moment had arrived for one final strike to bring everything to an end. But just as Burkle stepped forward, his body suddenly faltered, and the knights behind him gasped in concern at that unexpected stumble. In that brief opening, Asha'man seized a new sword marked with dark, pulsing runes, and with the last of his breath, he whispered one final taunt toward his executioner. He asked Burkle whether he had any last words, his bloodied lips curling into a grim smile as he declared that killing someone of his level would never be so simple. Even soaked in his own blood and pushed to the edge of death, The Necromancer still had one final move hidden beneath his sleeve. In the next instant, violent shadowy energy burst out from his body, roaring across the battlefield and surging straight toward Burkle with terrifying force. The raw pressure of that magic slammed into the night and hurled him backward, while Ashamon's eyes flared with an eerie and unfamiliar power. Raising his blade high, Ashamon prepared to unleash his final act of vengeance against the world that had brought him to this point. A blinding explosion of light swallowed the entire battlefield, washing over the soldiers and the corpses alike. And when the dust finally began to settle, the army erupted into cheers, convinced their enemy had fallen at last. Broken and motionless on the ground, Ashamon heard the sickening crack of his own neck echo through his fading senses. As the cries of victory drifted farther and farther away, his consciousness slipped into darkness, and his eyes slowly closed on the blurred figure standing above him. And with that, the 10-year war that had ravaged the continent and swallowed countless lives finally reached its end. This was the death of the demon of the continent, the feared necromancer known to the world as Ashamon. But at the very moment when everything should have ended for him, something impossible began to happen. The world around him suddenly changed, shifting away from the battlefield and into a vast, luxurious mansion on a night filled with raging storms. Inside that mansion, two maids buzzed with barely contained excitement after noticing that the young master's lips had twitched for the very first time. Feeling warmth around him and surrounded by a place he did not recognize, the mage could only wonder in confusion what in the world was happening. He had somehow been reborn as a newborn baby named Cleanse, with no idea what country this was, whose body he had entered, or how he had crossed from death into this strange new life. One of the maids gently held up a portrait for him to see, showing him the elegant image of a duchess and softly telling him that this woman was his mother. As the maid leaned closer and tried to coax him into saying something, Cleanse felt his tiny infant body tense with all its strength. With an effort that felt almost impossible in such a weak little frame, he struggled to force words past his lips, leaving the maids staring in stunned amazement. To the maids, it looked as if the gifted young master was desperately trying to speak his very first words. But in truth, Cleanse was not calling for his mother at all. He was trying to summon his dark servants and order them to obey him. Inside his mind, he screamed for his undead followers to answer his command, but to the women standing over the cradle, all they heard was the frightened, helpless crying of an ordinary baby. At that exact moment, lightning split the stormy sky above the mansion, flooding the night with a fierce white flash that seemed to swallow the entire estate in blinding light. And just like that, 15 years passed as quickly as a blink. By then, the mansion's garden fountain glittered beneath the warm afternoon sun, its clear water catching the light as it spilled gracefully into the basin. Nearby, a group of young ladies had gathered together, their eyes wide and their faces filled with a mixture of genuine surprise and breathless admiration. Across the vast estate, a young man walked with calm, effortless composure, every step steady and elegant as though the entire garden belonged beneath his feet. The girls lowered their voices and began whispering among themselves, completely captivated by his striking features and the way his long hair flowed around him. Then, his grown appearance came fully into view. Standing before them was an astonishingly handsome youth, his hair as pale and bright as freshly fallen snow. His beauty was so flawless that it almost did not feel human, as if some divine hand had carefully carved every line of his face. The young lady sighed dreamily, unable to stop praising how dazzling young Master Cleanse had become, and one of them even wondered aloud what kind of food he could possibly eat to grow into someone so beautiful. They could only imagine that a person would have to drink some kind of heavenly nectar to possess such an otherworldly appearance. But their dreamy admiration was shattered the instant a man marched into the garden, carrying a heavy bucket. Without a shred of warning, he threw the contents straight over Cleanse, drenching him in holy water while shouting for the evil spirit to leave the body it had possessed. That man was Garrison, a priest who had believed from the very beginning that something about young Cleanse was deeply, terribly wrong. Soaked and completely unimpressed, Cleanse stood there as Garrison pointed accusingly at the three girls nearby, insisting that they had already fallen under the boy's dark influence. Cleanse looked at the priest with clear irritation and asked whether he ever got tired of repeating this endless purification routine. But Garrison only became more certain, loudly insisting that the soul of the Archmage Ashamon was living inside the boy's body. Even when Cleanse denied being a necromancer, the priest caught sight of the boy's cold, sharp expression and immediately splashed him with yet another bucket of holy water. As Cleanse turned and walked away dripping wet, he muttered under his breath, wondering whether the priest was truly insane before quietly calling him a psychopath. Unfortunately, Garrison heard the insult. His face darkened at once, and he ordered his men to seize Cleanse and drag him away, declaring that the boy needed a bath in boiled water to learn his lesson. As the young man was hauled off against his will, his thoughts drifted back to the day he had died. He could still remember his execution with painful clarity, as if the blade and the battlefield were right in front of him again. After that came the jarring, impossible sensation of opening his eyes inside an infant's body, and because the first words he tried to speak were actually a dark necromantic incantation, everything had gone wrong from the start. From the moment he was born into this life, he had been marked and treated as a demon. And while he was still trapped in that helpless newborn state, he first encountered the priest of the Holy Order, Garrison. Cleanse remembered the man's enormous silhouette looming above him, casting a terrifying shadow over his tiny body. That first meeting became the beginning of 15 straight years of absolute misery. His childhood had been filled with endless prayer sessions that went on for 24 hours without stopping. There were forced baths in freezing garlic water, along with public purification displays where he was tied to a cross as fire blazed around him for everyone to watch. All of it was dressed up as holy ritual, but to Cleanse, it was nothing more than every kind of torture imaginable. Now, 15 years later, he sat at his own party wearing an expression of complete disgust, as though the entire celebration had already drained the life out of him. Beside him, his personal maid, Erin, prayed with sincere devotion, hoping that her young master would one day follow the legacy of a true hero. Cleanse, however, looked like he wanted to be anywhere but there. As the religious atmosphere pushed his patience to its limit, he suddenly stood up and flung his party hat across the room. Erin looked as if her heart had been stepped on, complaining that she had made that hat with her own hands and poured her whole heart into it. The moment Cleanse saw how hurt she looked, guilt tugged at him. With a sigh, he turned to pick the hat back up and prepare an apology. But that sympathy disappeared the second Erin admitted that Priest Garrison was actually the one who had made it. Cleanse stopped dead in place, his face twisting with pure horror and deep, instinctive disgust. Just then, Garrison appeared behind him, his loud voice booming through the room as he called out Cleanse's name. The priest looked genuinely moved, almost to the point of tears, touched by the thought that Cleanse had supposedly worn the hat for an entire week without ever taking it off. In response, Cleanse placed the hat on the floor and crushed it beneath his heel, wearing a bright smile as he declared that he would never put on that trash again. Garrison instantly exploded with rage, screaming that the evil spirit of Ashimon had finally exposed its true nature. But before the confrontation could spiral any further, it was suddenly interrupted. Commander Dunkel arrived, and his presence immediately changed the weight of the room. Stepping forward with a firm voice, he remarked that the rumors about Cleanse being Ashimon's reincarnation had already been circulating for more than 10 years. He then reminded Garrison that the Holy Order itself had officially investigated the child and declared that there was nothing abnormal about him. The moment he heard that, Garrison let go of Cleanse right away, lowering his posture and nodding in obedient agreement with the commander. As Cleanse scrambled back up from the floor, he noticed something chilling. Garrison could ignore him without a second thought, but when Dunkel spoke, the priest obeyed instantly. That meant the man was not simply a crazed fanatic. He was more like a shark, someone who understood exactly how power and politics worked. As Garrison turned to leave the hall, he suddenly paused and glanced back over his shoulder. With that lingering look, he warned them that no one could say what might happen someday in the distant future. After leaving behind that ominous remark, Garrison politely bid everyone farewell, only to poke his head back in a moment later and cheerfully remind Cleanse that they would meet again next time. The purification ritual had been set for the coming Friday. Cleanse stood there watching the man wave as if nothing had happened, while a silent fury burned hotter and hotter in his veins. Through clenched teeth, he forced the words down in his throat, telling himself he only had to endure it until then. Once he was finally alone, the young man's restraint snapped. He drove his fist hard into the sofa, the soft cushions swallowing the impact, but doing nothing to calm the frustration spilling out of him. No matter how many times he turned it over in his mind, he simply couldn't understand it. How could a man calmly torture a child again and again, and still have everyone around him bow their heads, as if he were some sacred holy cleric? Erin slowly approached him, holding out a towel with both hands. Her steps were hesitant, her voice barely above a whisper, and the question she asked sounded like something she had been carrying in her heart for years. Was he really no longer the Archmage? Cleanse rejected the idea instantly, with a force that came from the very core of him. He swore he wanted nothing to do with that name, and as long as he was alive, he never wanted to hear it spoken in front of him again. But deep inside, his thoughts were nowhere near that simple. Behind his angry denial, secrets churned like a storm, and he knew better than anyone that the truth could not be revealed to a single soul. Ever since his rebirth, his life had looked luxurious from the outside, but in reality, it was nothing more than a gilded cage. Because of the rumors surrounding him, every move he made had been watched, and that suspicion had even led to him being locked away inside a monastery for 7 painful years. Wanting to steer the conversation away from himself, the boy asked about the executor, wondering aloud whether that title meant the man held a truly high-ranking position. The man standing beside him grew noticeably more solemn at that question. In a low, serious tone, he explained that within the order, the title of executor belonged to the strongest warrior they had, and that answer made Clint's eyes widen in genuine surprise. According to him, almost no one in the world could stand against an executor once they moved to fight. The only exception people dared to name was the Duke of Clint's own noble family. Hearing just how powerful his own bloodline was, Clint's expression brightened despite himself. He brought his hands together and began clapping with open excitement, clearly impressed by the scale of strength hidden in his family name. His curiosity immediately pushed him further. Leaning into the topic, he asked who, among all the dukes in the history of their house, had ever been considered the strongest. The man answered carefully, saying that the 7th Duke, Clint's own father, was certainly a terrifyingly powerful figure. But even so, the one who still stood at the very peak of the family's history was the 1st Duke. Clint was genuinely caught off guard by that. He had assumed the current generation, especially his father, represented the highest point the family had ever reached. But the man's belief did not waver for even a moment. In his eyes, the founder of the house remained an unmatched existence, someone no later duke had ever truly surpassed. Noticing how intensely the boy had become invested in the topic, the man softened his response. Rather than argue any further, he simply went along with the young master's interest, agreeing in a way that seemed meant to satisfy him. Aaron, however, noticed something else. Clint's eyes were no longer wandering around the room. His gaze had locked onto one particular portrait hanging on the wall of the Grand Hall. Commander Dunkel watched the situation unfold and quietly reflected on the strange irony of fate. No one, not even in their wildest imagination, could have predicted a twist as absurd as this. 200 years had passed since the 1st Duke founded their noble house. Yet as Clint stood there beneath the grand portraits of his ancestors, staring up at the long history painted across the walls, he still couldn't fully accept the ridiculous reality of the life he had been reborn into. His eyes moved slowly from one portrait to the next, taking in the faces of all the men who had carried the family before him. Then, at last, his gaze settled on the very 1st Duke, the man praised as the strongest in their entire lineage. There, enclosed in an ornate golden frame, a man stared back at him with eyes that seemed filled with unshakable justice. It was the 1st Duke of the Rhineland family himself, Berkel Rhineland. The Necromancer Ashamon had not merely been reborn into some random noble body. By the cruelest joke imaginable, he had become a direct descendant of the very man who had killed him. The memory of his own death came rushing back so vividly that it felt as if the scream were still trapped in his ears. In his final breath, filled with hatred and defeat, he had spat out his rival's name. He could still remember the weight of Berkel's words, that infuriatingly righteous declaration claiming all the slaughter had been for the sake of the children's future. Then came that final merciless strike. The villainous Necromancer, once feared across the land, was cut down and sent plunging toward the frozen, snow-covered earth, broken and utterly defeated. All at once, the young boy jolted awake in his bed. His chest rose and fell violently as he struggled to catch his breath, his small body pressed against the plush mattress inside his luxurious suite. He cursed under his breath, furious that the nightmare of his former life had returned to torment him again. Centuries ago, he had been a towering embodiment of malice, a monster powerful enough to nearly grind the entire continent into dust beneath him. And yet, after being cut down by a hero, he had somehow been thrown back into the world 200 years later, forced to begin again in a completely different body. He ran a hand through his snow-white hair and stared at himself with a bitter grimace. No matter how many times he saw that delicate reflection, he still couldn't connect this fragile young appearance with the terrifying monster he used to be. The heavy silence hanging over the room was suddenly broken by a cold voice from the doorway. With a chilling edge of mockery, someone remarked that the young master had been talking in his sleep again. Priest Garrison stood there wearing a sinister, knowing grin, his eyes fixed on Cleanse as if he had already guessed too much. He prodded him about those memories, and Cleanse immediately scrambled to cover himself, forcing out an excuse about simple exhaustion. Before he could regain his composure, the door burst open and his red-haired maid, Erin, rushed into the room in a panic. Completely agitated, she blurted that she had overheard his frightening sleep talk, then began repeating his villainous mutterings aloud, as if quoting a terrifying confession. Cleanse's face changed instantly. In sheer panic, he lunged toward her, trying to stop her from saying another word, desperately pleading for her to keep quiet before the situation spiraled any further. But by then, it was already too late. At that exact moment, the head butler arrived and announced that the family sword exhibition was about to begin. After hearing the reports about the boy's strange behavior, Garrison's expression turned even colder. He declared that Cleanse's purification sessions would be doubled, and as he spoke, he clamped a hand over Erin's mouth to silence her. The young heir stood there trembling, his small body tight, with a mix of suppressed rage and disbelief. The sheer injustice of it all was almost too much for him to swallow. As they made their way toward the courtyard, Cleanse silently hurled every curse he knew at the priest in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that the man was an absolute lunatic. Trying to focus on something else, he turned to the servants and asked about the sword event. The butler answered that the Duke himself had personally ordered Cleanse to attend the ceremony. That sudden interest from his father caught Cleanse by surprise. While processing the meaning behind the summons, he reached out and accepted a handkerchief offered to him by a young maid. The mustachioed butler immediately snapped at the girl, scolding her for bothering the master. But Cleanse stepped in without hesitation, defending her calmly before handing her a biscuit, which sent the young maid into a state of pure munching happiness. Looking out across the grand estate, Cleanse quietly tried to piece together why his father had summoned him so suddenly. Then the butler added another detail, and the real reason began to take shape. Relatives from the secondary branch of the family had arrived at the estate for a visit. The moment Cleanse heard that, his expression darkened. He already knew exactly what kind of irritating noble performance was waiting for him inside. As soon as he stepped into the hall, the relatives from the noble branches seemed to close in at once. Their eyes lit up with thinly veiled malice, like predators who had been waiting for the perfect target. They wasted no time before mocking him, deliberately calling him by the name of the ancient villain, clearly hoping to watch him flinch in front of everyone. Their laughter spread through the hall as they loudly reminded one another that the so-called demon child had spent 7 miserable years wasting away inside a monastery. Cleanse simply watched them with cold, measuring eyes. In an instant, he identified the gluttons from the northern branch, people who had obviously come all this way for no grand family duty, but just to eat their fill for free. Then his gaze slid toward a blonde girl nearby. Her posture alone radiated unbearable arrogance, and as another relative from the side branch, she looked perfectly prepared to turn the family gathering into a battlefield of insults. The girl from the western branch held herself with icy superiority. Her eyes swept over everyone in the room, as if every person there existed beneath the level of her breath. But Cleanse refused to give them the reaction they wanted. Ignoring every petty provocation and every sharp insult thrown his way, the primary heir walked straight past the group without slowing down, leaving them standing behind him, fuming in his wake. One of the cousins finally reached the end of his patience. His face flushed red with anger as he barked at Cleanse from behind, demanding to know whether that piece of trash really planned to ignore them inside his own family's home. The arrogant noble kept shouting, his voice echoing through the room, but to the former archmage, the whole thing was almost laughable. These branch family members were acting as if they had any right to stand there and claim ownership over the main estate. Cleanse looked back at them with eyes as cold as frozen glass and said flatly that he had never even bothered to remember the names of people like them. Deep down, his contempt only grew stronger, because if these upstarts dared to show such open disrespect inside the main family's own walls, then the Rhineland house must have fallen further than he thought. Before the tension could break into something uglier, the attention of the crowd suddenly shifted toward the arena, where 2 young swordsmen were already locked in a fierce sparring match. A purple-haired youth rushed forward first, gripping his sword tightly as he poured all of his nervous energy into one desperate attack. But the pressure bearing down on him was clearly far more than he could handle. The counterattack struck with overwhelming force. The purple-haired boy's stance collapsed beneath him, and in the next instant, he was sent tumbling backward before hitting the ground in clear defeat. Humiliation burned across his face as he pushed himself up, seething with frustration. Unable to accept the gap between them, he shouted for his opponent to stop holding back and fight him seriously with everything he had. The golden-haired boy standing above him received the next wild flurry of attacks without the slightest panic. His sword moved with effortless grace, and with a calm, confident smile on his lips, he declared that the match had already been decided. This was Delon Rhineland, Cleanse's older half-brother. Just standing there with that composed expression and flawless posture, he gave off the unmistakable aura of someone who knew he stood far above the rest. While Delon carried the prestigious name of the family on his shoulders, Cleanse watched the duel in silence. His eyes narrowed, then began to glow with a faint mystical purple light as he activated his magical sight, carefully dissecting every movement and ability on display. Driven by desperation and wounded pride, Delon's opponent forced himself forward again. He swore through gritted teeth that this time, the result would be different. Delon moved at once. His body surged forward, and his sword blurred through the air so quickly it almost looked like a flash of light cutting across the arena. Even as his opponent tried to counter with everything he had, Delon never lost control of the fight. He slipped between the attacks with smooth, practiced movements, even avoiding a downward slash with a fluid step that made the dodge look effortless. Then, all at once, a brilliant golden energy wrapped around Delon's body. His speed rose sharply, surpassing what ordinary eyes could clearly follow, as he prepared to unleash a special technique. Cleanse observed every detail without blinking. His magical sight captured Delon's footwork, the shift of his center of gravity, and the exact instant he pressed the tip of his toe against the ground to launch himself forward with explosive force. The purple-haired rival, now blinded by anger, gambled everything on one final decisive blow. His sword shot forward, aimed straight for Delon's face. But to Cleanse, the most fascinating part was not the surface movement. Through his eyes, even the hidden flow of mana inside the family's secret sword art revealed itself in clear detail. In that split second, Delon released his strike. The famous meteor sword technique erupted with explosive force, and the blow landed dead center on his opponent. The judge immediately raised his voice and stopped the bout, declaring Delon the victor. And Delon, ever the polished superior, remained perfectly composed before the watching guests. With a gentle, friendly smile, the blond youth addressed his fallen opponent. His tone was calm, almost kind, but his words carried a sharp edge as he pointed out that if he had struck with full intent, the injury would have been serious. All around the arena, the guests began whispering in admiration, amazed by how cleanly Delon had executed such an advanced technique. Watching their reactions, Cleanse quickly understood that the display was not merely a duel, it was a calculated warning aimed at the secondary families. After the match, Delon noticed his younger brother in the crowd and walked over with a mocking grin. He asked whether Cleanse had been watching for long, then teased him by saying he would have tried even harder if he had known Cleanse was there. The implication was obvious. Delon wanted Cleanse to know that what he had just shown was not even his full effort. Looking at his brother's flawless swordsmanship and that perfectly crafted mask of kindness, the ancient villain felt a wave of genuine disgust rise inside him. At the same time, he couldn't stop wondering what the real purpose was behind gathering all these branch families in one place. Then the atmosphere inside the grand hall changed in an instant. A heavy presence settled over everyone as the seventh head of the clan made himself known. Duke Kinkle Rhineland's presence pressed through the hall before his words even came. Cleanse felt a sharp jolt of alarm as his father approached, and the entire room fell into a suffocating silence. The Duke gave his eldest son a rare nod of approval. In his reserved way, he acknowledged the immense effort Delon must have poured in to reach such a refined level of mastery. Cleanse watched the exchange with a cold, cynical gaze. It was painfully clear that Delon was the single source of pride for both the Duke and the Rhineland family itself. Commander Dunkel also spoke up, adding that Delon's command over the blade was truly extraordinary for someone of his age. Delon, always the perfect performer, lowered his head in a graceful bow. With carefully polished humility, he claimed that he still had much left to learn. As the patriarch walked past him, he briefly spoke of the heroic legacy their family carried. Delon bowed even deeper, showing a devoted respect that looked flawless in front of everyone. Then the Duke's gaze shifted. His eyes landed on Cleanse, and the warmth vanished completely, replaced by a stare that was frigid, sharp, and filled with undisguised contempt. He said nothing affectionate, not even a single soft word. The Duke merely stared down at the boy in silence, and that silence alone made it clear how much shame he felt toward this failed heir. Then, in front of the shocked guests, the clan leader reached out and placed his hand on the silver-haired boy's head. After sensing him for a moment, he coldly announced that there was not a single spark of mana inside Cleanse. Cleanse lowered his head and quietly apologized. He understood perfectly well that in this world, a noble born without magic was treated as little more than a dead man walking. Commander Dunkel quickly stepped forward to defend him, suggesting that the long years of isolation in the monastery may have simply stunted the boy's development. But by then, the damage had already been done. The crowd immediately began to whisper with cruel excitement. They gossiped about the heir who had no mana at all, muttering that if the main line had become this useless, then perhaps it was finally time for the branch families to take control. Later, as Cleanse walked away through the long corridors, he told himself he could endure the insults aimed at him personally. But then Burkel's famous words came back to him, those noble-sounding words about protecting the future. His fists tightened at his sides until his knuckles turned white. A tidal wave of rage surged through him, hot and violent enough to drown out everything else. To the former Archmage, the irony was almost unbearable. He had lost his life to a man whose proud lineage had now decayed into something so pathetic and worthless. As the guests began leaving the estate, the mockery still refused to die down. Dalton, the purple-haired youth from the branch family, stepped directly into Cleanse's path and blocked him. With a sneering voice, he began taunting him, asking how a highborn heir could be so useless that he did not even know how to swing a sword. The meddler kept running his mouth, pushing the insult further as he branded Cleanse a disgrace to the Rhineland name. Cleanse remained calm on the outside, his expression barely changing. But as he looked at Dalton, he saw him for exactly what he was, a talentless busybody with no value worth acknowledging. When Dalton raised his fists in a petty burst of anger, Cleanse casually called him naive and incredibly stupid. The insult struck exactly where it needed to, and Dalton, enraged beyond control, stomped the ground with violent force as he prepared to attack. But before Dalton could do anything, Cleanse moved in a flash. The young heir swept his legs out from under him with brutal precision, sending the loudmouth boy crashing face first onto the hard stone floor. Blood began leaking from Dalton's nose as he lay there stunned, unable to immediately process what had just happened. Cleanse looked down at him coldly and advised him not to vent his frustrations on other people. But Dalton, desperate and humiliated, screamed one final low blow, calling the silver-haired boy a motherless bastard. The moment those words left Dalton's mouth, Cleanse slowly turned his head. His eyes ignited with a terrifying predatory glow, burning with pure fury as the air around him seemed to grow dangerously still. The moment he saw that demonic look spread across Cleanse's face, the cowardly boy completely locked up. His face drained of color, his shoulders stiffened, and cold sweat broke out across his skin as real terror finally sank in. Looking down at the trembling boy in front of him, Cleanse's eyes grew colder. As the former villain watched him shake, he could not help thinking that the true sickness rotting this family came from people like Dalton, who wore their disgusting superiority like a crown. Deep inside his veins, a faint trace of ancient magic began to stir, like something long buried was waking again. Cleanse silently wondered how much longer he would be forced to act like a powerless weakling. For someone who remembered true power, swallowing this humiliation was bitter enough, but seeing how far the clan had declined made it even worse. In that moment, Cleanse remembered the radiant image of the hero who had once struck him down, shining with almost divine brilliance. Compared to that overwhelming figure, the descendants of Burkle looked so miserable and pathetic that he actually felt a faint trace of pity. His dark thoughts were cut short when a commanding presence arrived in the corridor. The commander's voice thundered through the hall, ordering the injured Dalton to stop causing such a disgraceful commotion at once. The knight stood there with his back straight and his posture as firm as iron. His tone made it perfectly clear that while he was present, he would not allow this kind of open disrespect to continue for even another second. Dalton clenched his teeth so hard his jaw trembled, his face twisted with silent rage. But no matter how furious he was, he did not have the courage to talk back to a man with the commander's authority and strength. As Dalton was forced to retreat, he still could not swallow his pride. He turned his head and threw one last bitter remark over his shoulder, sneering that Cleanse should be thankful to have such a loyal bodyguard protecting him. After saying that, the defeated boy hurried away in a ridiculous hopping motion, looking more pathetic than threatening. The commander could only stare after him with a baffled expression, as if even he did not know what to make of it. Once Dalton was gone, the knight rested one steady hand on the hilt of his sword. Then he turned back toward Cleanse and assured him in a calm, firm voice that the area was secure now. The silver-haired boy quietly watched his subordinate for a moment, his expression distant and impossible to read. Only after a stretch of silence did he finally open his mouth to speak. He looked straight at the knight and asked in the simplest tone possible whether he had a spare sword that Cleanse could borrow for a while. Later that night, the two of them walked far into the dark forest surrounding the estate. Thick mist rolled across the ground, swallowing their footsteps and making the trees around them look even more silent and eerie. When they finally stopped, the great warrior reached out and handed a heavy steel blade to the boy. The weapon looked cold and solid under the night air, its weight settling directly into Cleanse's hands. The commander looked at the young master with clear confusion and asked why he would need a sword at such a late hour, especially in a place like this. Cleanse said nothing. He simply tightened his grip around the hilt and lowered himself into a combat stance, copying the same posture he had seen from his brother. Watching this, the guard quietly decided it was probably time to return to the mansion, assuming the boy was only clinging to a desperate dream of becoming a swordsman. Deep down, the warrior felt a wave of pity rise in his chest as he looked at the young master standing there with the sword. After all, he knew the cruel truth better than anyone. Without even a single drop of mana, effort alone could never overcome the wall standing in front of him. In this empire, someone born without magical power had no real chance of becoming a knight, no matter how much they trained or how badly they wanted it. Cleanse, completely unaware of the commander's thoughts, began swinging the blade through the damp night air. Every movement was focused and deliberate, as if he were trying to defy the very idea that he could never use the family's secret sword arts. Then Cleanse slowly closed his eyes. As the former archmage searched through his memories, the scene from the arena returned to him with crystal-clear precision. He began recreating the incredible footwork he had seen Delon perform, step by step, as though he had studied it for years instead of witnessing it only once. His young body moved with an accuracy that should have been impossible for his age. With one clean leap, he matched the timing of the movement perfectly, copying the genius technique with frightening precision. Then, All at once, an unstable purple aura began curling around the sharp edge of the blade, twisting like living smoke in the darkness. As Cleanse reproduced the sword's path with terrifying perfection, purple sparks snapped and hissed around his glowing eye. The air around him shifted violently, as if the entire atmosphere had suddenly been pulled tight. The commander immediately spun back around. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he stood completely frozen where he was. He could not understand the crushing aura of power pouring out from the very boy he had always believed to be a burden. His mind simply refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. In the next heartbeat, the air erupted. A massive slash of jagged purple energy tore forward like a violent storm, racing straight toward a huge boulder in the distance. But right as that overwhelming power reached its peak, a sharp light ripped across Cleanse's pupil, violently disturbing the flow of energy gathered inside him. The shadowy aura around the blade shattered in an instant. It broke apart and scattered into the cold night wind, vanishing like fragments of glass. Even with the technique interrupted, the result was still terrifying. The enormous rock had been split cleanly in two, and the freshly cut surface glowed faintly in the darkness. The commander stood there utterly speechless, staring at the severed boulder as if everything he believed had just collapsed. Cleanse slowly turned around, still holding the sword with a steady and unmoving grip. A faint smile touched Cleanse's lips, surprised but knowing. He realized that the ancient power he once commanded was finally beginning to respond to him again. He had really done it. He had copied that powerful technique with chilling accuracy. Not far away, the young maid Erin stood frozen in place. Her mouth had fallen open, and her entire body seemed locked in shock, unable to process the impossible scene she had just witnessed. The commander was not in much better shape. A single bead of sweat slid down his temple as he stared at the boulder, his mind spinning from the realization that the supposedly mannerless boy was anything but ordinary. The scene changed suddenly to the next morning, where the young heir was found with his head shoved deep into a bucket of water. The commander stood nearby, watching him with a casual expression as he remarked that Cleanse could now hold his breath for well over a minute. Only then did the boy yank his head out, gasping hard for air. Cleanse was forced to endure the night's dry jokes about his strange aquarium-like routine, even while water dripped from his silver hair and down his face. He snapped at the guard in irritation, but the knight only laughed it off. Still, that relaxed look did not last long, because his eyes soon sharpened as he admitted he had sensed a distinctly sinister energy coming from the young master's room earlier. While the maid carefully dried the damp strands of Cleanse's silver hair, a servant approached with formal steps. In his hands, he carried a sealed envelope meant for the young heir. The messenger bowed and informed Cleanse that Dalton had sent him a personal invitation. Cleanse blinked once, as if the name meant nothing to him for a second. The servant had to remind him that Dalton was the same person who supposedly wanted to offer him an apology. The former archmage immediately remembered the pathetic punch that boy had tried to throw at him, and a dismissive scoff slipped out before he could even bother hiding it. Cleanse knew perfectly well that an idiot like Dalton was not suddenly seeking forgiveness out of sincerity. As he held the parchment in his hand, the silver-haired heir's suspicion only grew stronger. After reading through the contents, he learned that the invitation was for a hunting competition, the kind of classic setup that practically announced itself as a trap. It was obvious what Dalton was trying to do. He wanted a convenient excuse to lure Cleanse out into the wilderness, far away from the protection and watchful eyes of the manor. When the messenger asked for his final answer, Cleanse slowly raised his gaze. A sharp, determined glint flashed in his eyes as he calmly said he had no reason to refuse. Because deep down, Cleanse knew something Dalton did not. In this game, he was the one holding the ultimate advantage. His eyes drifted toward the sword leaning against the wall. After obsessively studying his brother's movements, Cleanse had uncovered a terrifying talent hidden within himself. As long as he saw an ability just once, he could reproduce it perfectly, turning someone else's skill into his own with frightening ease. The commander immediately went to prepare the carriage for the hunting event ahead. Since this so-called invitation already smelled suspicious, he firmly insisted on going with Cleanse himself, making it clear that he would personally ensure the young master's safety. As he handled the preparations, the commander narrowed his eyes and studied Cleanse with obvious suspicion. He asked what kind of plan the young master was secretly putting together this time. Cleanse's expression turned unusually serious. With his silver hair framing his calm face, he reminded the guard of the conversation they had before, the one about the strange changes happening inside his power. The knight answered in a low voice that today felt different for some reason. There was a strange heaviness in the air around them, a dark and ominous pressure that seemed to trail after the carriage as it began its rough journey toward the distant castle. The road ahead was harsh and uneven, full of treacherous bumps and hidden dips. As the carriage entered the woods, it lurched from side to side so violently that the whole cabin rattled with every turn of the wheels. Inside that cramped carriage, poor little Erin was quickly losing the battle against motion sickness. Her face had turned a sickly shade of green, and she clutched her stomach tightly as the shaking only grew worse. Before long, Eren slumped weakly against the commander's side. The knight could only let out a helpless sigh, muttering that he had already warned her not to come along on a trip like this. Before handing her a pillow to rest on, Cleanse turned his gaze toward the thick trees outside the window. In a calm voice, he explained that the forest roads were always brutal on anyone who was not used to traveling through them. The great warrior gently encouraged Eren to close her eyes and sleep through the discomfort. Seeing Cleanse offer the pillow so naturally, he seemed genuinely touched, believing for a moment that the young master was showing unexpected kindness. But Cleanse immediately ruined that touching impression with a blunt clarification. The pillow, he made clear, was meant for Eren's comfort only, not for the commander to lean on. After that brief exchange, the white-haired boy fell into a thoughtful silence. He sat quietly by the carriage window, watching the blur of trees pass by outside. His eyes remained fixed on the ancient forest, but his mind seemed far away. As the woods rolled past him, he silently thought about just how much the world had changed over the last 200 years. 2 centuries ago, this very land had looked nothing like the forest before him now. What had become lush and alive had once been a barren wasteland, buried beneath heavy snow and weighed down by the cold presence of countless dead. The former villain gazed at the transformed scenery with a distant, almost conflicted look. Though he hated to admit it, even he had to feel a flicker of respect, because Burkle had truly managed to turn this old graveyard into a better world. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted when a guard opened the carriage door from the outside. With a formal announcement, the man informed them that they had arrived at the vast estate of the Cornwell family. Cleanse stepped down onto the gravel and slowly lifted his gaze toward the towering building ahead. To his surprise, the manor looked even grander and more extravagant than his own ducal residence. He dryly remarked that for something as simple as a children's hunting competition, the host certainly had an absurd amount of money to throw around. Just then, a familiar and unpleasant voice cut sharply through the air, calling Cleanse's name from somewhere across the estate grounds. Dalton came walking toward him with a smug look on his face, surrounded by a pack of thin, panting hunting dogs. With a sneer, he asked what the silver-haired piece of trash was staring at so intently. Then Dalton openly bragged that the luxury of the Cornwell Manor had been built using wealth taken from Cleanse's own family. He finished the insult with a mocking laugh, clearly enjoying every word. Beside Dalton, one of the large hounds lowered its head and released a deep, guttural growl. Thick strands of saliva hung from its jaws and dripped onto the ground beneath it. Cleanse noticed immediately that the animals looked disturbingly thin, almost starved. Without showing much reaction, he asked in a flat voice when the competition was actually going to begin. Dalton brushed off his impatience with a careless wave of his hand. Instead, he told Cleanse to watch closely, as if he were about to put on some grand performance. Then, with deliberate cruelty written all over his face, Dalton released the starving pack forward without the slightest hesitation. The ferocious dogs charged into the woods, and Dalton explained that he had scattered bait across the mountain to lure wild beasts into the area. He proudly bragged that a starving dog's sense of smell was 100,000 times sharper than that of a human, making them perfect tools for this twisted hunt. As the hounds tore through the brush in pursuit of the bait, Dalton calmly lifted his bow and took aim. The dogs sprinted forward with their jaws wide open, driven by raw hunger and desperation. But the moment they reached the bait, Dalton's arrows struck them down one after another, their painful yelps echoing through the woods while he laughed at his own cruel success. Eren was horrified by the senseless brutality playing out in front of her. Unable to stay silent, the little maid stepped forward, ready to defend her master's honor despite her fear. Dalton only glanced at her with contempt, recognizing her as the little brat Cleanse always seemed to drag around with him. He reached out as if he were merely going to pat her head, but the look on his face twisted into something far more sinister. As he asked what a useless girl like her could possibly offer, his hand suddenly shot down and grabbed Eren's arm with bruising force, yanking her toward him. Before Dalton could take things any further, Cleanse's hand clamped down around his wrist like a steel vise. Cleanse's eyes burned with a cold, predatory fury. In a voice sharp enough to freeze the air, he warned Dalton to take his hands off her, or he would break his arm right there on the spot. Dalton's eyes widened in shock at the raw strength crushing his wrist. Panicking, he threw a desperate punch toward Cleanse's face, but Cleanse avoided it with a smooth, effortless tilt of his head, while Dalton tried to hide his fear behind a sneer. Realizing the confrontation was slipping out of his control, Dalton quickly jumped onto his horse. From the saddle, he challenged Cleanse to follow him deeper into the heart of the hunt. Cleanse mounted his own horse and ordered the commander to remain behind to protect Eren, promising that he would return soon. But the knight refused to simply step aside, standing firm as he revealed a magic scroll tucked into his belt. He explained that it was a signaling charm activated by tearing it apart, a rare tool that could be used even without mana. With that scroll, The commander would be able to rush to Clean's side the moment danger appeared, no matter how deep into the forest the young master went. Clean's gave a sharp nod, already aware that Dalton's father was a suspicious man. If Dalton planned to lure him into the deep woods, then this was probably not just some childish game, but the beginning of something far darker. The tension had already reached its breaking point. Before urging his horse forward, Clean's looked back at the commander with a gaze that carried far more weight than any ordinary teenager should have. He told the knight to tear the scroll the instant things turned bad. Then, with absolute calm, Clean's assured him that if that moment came, a great storm would rise in his hand. That cryptic promise left the warrior standing in silence, watching closely as the young master rode away and disappeared into the shadowy trees. Time slipped away little by little until night settled over the forest. The woods transformed into a maze of tangled branches, deep darkness, and thin silver moonlight. As Clean's rode deeper into the darkness, the former archmage calmly considered the situation. Dalton could not have hidden himself too far away, no matter how much he wanted to turn this into a trap. At last, Clean's burst into a clearing and found Dalton waiting for him. The purple-haired boy stood like a twisted silhouette against the aftermath of a massacre, surrounded by slaughtered animals as he sneered and asked why the illustrious heir had taken so long to arrive. Clean's slowly dismounted from his horse, his eyes moving carefully across the strange and gruesome scene spread out before him. The lifeless bodies of the hunting dogs lay scattered around Dalton like grotesque decorations. Their blood soaked into the dark earth, turning the clearing into something closer to a killing ground than a hunting site. Dalton rose to his feet, and a manic gleam flashed in his eyes. With obvious excitement, he declared that they had finally reached the grand finale of their competition. Then he drew his sword and revealed the truth behind the entire hunt. From the very beginning, the final prey Dalton had chosen was Clean's himself. With a cruel smile, Dalton threatened to slaughter Clean's and then carry the news of his tragic accident back to his elder sister like some twisted trophy. Dalton's mouth curled with contempt as he began ridiculing the Rhineland family name, sneering that their so-called noble bloodline was nothing but an empty, laughable joke. Then, with a cruel grin spreading across his face, Dalton lifted his hand and silently gave the signal for the men waiting and hiding to reveal themselves. In the next instant, hooded figures slipped out from the darkness between the trees like ghosts, each one raising a bow and locking their arrows directly onto the white-haired boy. They mocked his misfortune with cold voices, telling him that his only real mistake was being born into the wrong family during the worst possible time. But the silver-haired boy did not flinch. He stood there without moving an inch, calmly taking in the entire ambush with a distant, icy expression, as if the whole scene barely interested him. Dalton kept running his mouth, proudly declaring that by tomorrow, every corner of the continent would be whispering about the collapse of the legendary sword family, while its young master would be reduced to nothing but scraps for the beasts of the forest. Standing before what should have been certain death, Clean's suddenly found his thoughts drifting back to Burkle's irritatingly noble words about protecting the future. A faint, mocking smile tugged at the corner of Clean's lips, and that tiny reaction only made Dalton more irritated, more confused, and more uneasy. Then, to everyone's horror, the boy actually started laughing. It was not a soft laugh either, but a deep, unstable cackle that rolled through the dark forest and echoed between the trees. That laughter sounded far too old, far too twisted, to belong to such a small body. Dalton instinctively stepped back, his face tightening as he demanded whether this silver-haired freak had finally gone insane. Clean's raised one hand over his face, his shoulders trembling as he tried and failed to hold back his laughter, as though the pathetic irony of the situation was simply too much for him to bear. When he finally lowered his hand and looked up again, his eyes were no longer human. A sharp blood-red light burned inside them, and he addressed Dalton like a cheeky brat, his voice now carrying a terrifying authority that had not been there before. The purple-haired boy froze on the spot. Sweat ran down his face in thick drops as a deep, instinctive terror clawed its way into his soul. Clean's tone turned colder as he reminded them that this family had been built on the foundation of his own death, and he would never allow a swarm of insects like them to defile it. In that moment, a violent shadow-blue aura erupted from Clean's body, spreading outward like a storm and shaking the ground beneath everyone's feet. Dalton screamed in panic, convinced that Clean's had been hiding some kind of secret magic. But Clean's only smiled wickedly and corrected him. This power was not magic at all. It was pure demonic energy, the raw and terrifying essence that once belonged to the ancient Necromancer himself. The henchmen immediately lost their composure. Their hands shook around their weapons as they whispered in fear, finally wondering what sort of monster they had truly trapped in this forest. Floating high above the ground, held in the air by his own dark power, Clean's reached into the depths of forgotten history and called upon the ancient evil spirits buried beneath time to rise once again. Under his name, the dark energy twisted, gathered, and coiled like living smoke, while the former archmage commanded his creations to devour everything standing before them. From the deepest shadows, a colossal skeleton began to emerge, its massive frame towering over the battlefield as Cleanse ordered the creature to consume every enemy in its path. Dalton screamed in disbelief, his voice cracking as he recognized the terrifying undead army from the old legends of Asha'man, the ancient demon king. With a chilling smile that carried the calm hunger of a predator, the protagonist slowly raised one finger toward his enemies, as if that single gesture had already sealed their fate. Then memory surged through him. He remembered once believing he had forgotten the man he used to be, yet for too long, agonizing centuries, he had existed alone, buried within a mountain of bones and skulls. Those years had been an endless cycle of darkness, where there was no warmth, no light, and nothing to feel except the constant echo of the dead calling to him from the depths of the abyss. That haunting resonance had become a kind of nostalgia, one he could never fully silence or escape from. It was the one sensation that still anchored him, the one reminder that pulled him back toward the truth of who he really was. Back in the present, the air grew heavy and suffocating. Enormous dark clouds swallowed the moonlight above the forest, while Dalton kept shrieking that this could not be real, repeating the forbidden name of the archmage in pure terror. Cleanse merely smiled at him, calmly confirming that yes, that was indeed the name the world once trembled to hear. The henchmen, who had been frozen in place only moments earlier, began murmuring nervously among themselves, questioning whether the stories about the Demon King had truly been nothing more than myths. They stared as the giant skeletons held their ground, and then the empty sockets in those skulls ignited with fierce blood-red light, cutting through the darkness like burning eyes. But after the first wave of fear passed, the mercenaries slowly found their courage again and burst into loud, mocking laughter. They called the skeletons nothing but trash, bragging that they had smashed and dismantled hundreds of undead creatures just like them during past missions. One of the mercenaries even laughed about snapping off a bone and taking it home as a souvenir, as though this terrifying army was no more than a pile of decorations. Their leader barked orders to clear the path and eliminate the boy standing in the center of the storm. At the same time, one man stepped forward, lifting a massive heavy crossbow and aiming its deadly point straight at the silver-haired youth. At the sharp command to fire, arrows and bolts launched all at once, whistling through the night air in a deadly rain as they arced across the dark sky toward the protagonist and his undead legion. The storm of projectiles closed in at lethal speed, their sharp tips flashing in Cleanse's eyes as they rushed toward him, ready to tear through flesh and bone. But at the very instant the first arrow should have struck him, the entire volley stopped cold in midair, as though it had slammed into an invisible wall that could not be broken. Dalton shouted in triumph, already convinced that the barrage had turned the space around Cleanse into a pincushion. But his victory lasted for only a heartbeat. As the dust and disturbed air began to clear, Dalton's face twisted in horror when he saw Cleanse still standing there completely unharmed. Huge spectral shields had appeared in front of the skeletons, catching every arrow without fail. The army of the dead had not moved an inch, standing like a perfect silent wall of bone and dark power, ready to turn the hunters into prey. The skeletons now looked even more imposing, each one armed with heavy shields that had materialized to crush any hope of a second attack. Cleanse looked down on his enemies with a mix of pity and disgust, murmuring that 200 years was a long time, long enough for the world to forget the real terror of his legions. The henchmen spiraled into panic again, their eyes widening as they stared at the shields that had appeared from nothing in the bony hands of those monsters. Cleanse spoke with chilling calm, explaining that ordinary skeletons might indeed be brittle and easy to break, but the ones under his command were made from something on an entirely different level. With a sharp, confident smile, he declared that his undead were nothing like the weak creatures they had faced before. That revelation, combined with the boy's absolute composure, dragged Dalton even deeper into paralyzing dread. Then Cleanse turned his attention to the battlefield and issued a cold command to his first unit. He ordered them to advance and break the enemy formation, vowing that those who dared mock the future of the North would be crushed by his own hands. With that final order, his troops surged forward with overwhelming force. The giant skeletons charged across the clearing at a speed that completely defied their skeletal bodies, catching the mercenaries off guard before they could recover. The enemies gasped in disbelief, unable to understand how piles of bone that should have been slow and mindless could move with such vicious, predatory agility. A deathly, bone-chilling battle cry tore through the silence, vibrating deep within the minds of the living. With that sound, the army of the dead surged forward, plunging into the heat of the fray. The mercenary leader roared, his voice cracking as he desperately commanded his men to hold their ground and push back the rising panic. But his desperate shouts were utterly swallowed by the cacophony of violence and the grinding of teeth and steel. One of his subordinates barely had time to react before a skeleton slammed into him with brutal force. His body crumpled, broken and limp as he was sent flying through the air. The massacre began in earnest. The once quiet woods were now choked with the frantic, terminal screams of dying men and the relentless, rhythmic clatter of skeletal armor and bone. Dalton stood paralyzed, watching in sheer horror as the battlefield transformed into a grisly slaughterhouse, a nightmare reality forged by his own hands. Without skipping a beat, the young mage calmly signaled for his second unit, the crossbowmen, to sweep through the clearing and hunt down any remaining stragglers. High above, nestled within the gnarled, twisting branches of the surrounding trees, skeletal archers shifted into firing positions, their hollow, empty eye sockets locking onto targets with terrifying, mechanical precision. A wave of icy dread washed over the surviving mercenaries. Their blood turned to ice the moment they realized these undead horrors were equipped with deadly, long-range capabilities. With a short, cold, and entirely clinical command, the former archmage ordered his archers to let fly, without a shred of mercy. In a heartbeat, a volley of lethal, jagged arrows whistled through the oppressive dark air, traveling at speeds that defied natural sight. The mercenaries were cut down exactly where they stood. The sheer force of the bolts pinned their bodies to the earth, leaving them to wail in agony as they were effectively anchored to the forest floor. One particularly resilient mercenary leader refused to surrender, lunging forward to deflect the heavy, crushing blow of a skeleton's blade with his own sword. Hyperventilating in pure desperation, he shouted that this was completely impossible, screaming that no common necromancer should ever be capable of commanding such perfectly coordinated, relentless power. He stared into the hollow faces of the undead, realizing with sudden, crushing clarity that if the battle proceeded at this rate, every single one of them would be utterly annihilated. Dalton watched his world collapse in real time, screaming for his men to listen to him, but his frantic pleas were completely drowned out by the deafening chaos of the carnage. He didn't hear the creature approach. A skeleton crept up directly behind him, its jagged, rusted blade rising high for a final, decisive killing blow. Snarling in a surge of raw, panicked rage, the purple-haired noble spun on his heel and delivered a precise, lightning-fast strike that cleanly severed the creature's skull from its spine. For one fleeting, hopeful second, he allowed himself to celebrate, convinced that he had discovered the critical weakness of these monsters by decapitating them. However, his brief spark of triumph turned to bitter ash. The headless body of the skeleton didn't drop, it kept right on moving. Instead of collapsing, the headless horror continued its relentless advance, swinging its weapon back at him with an unrelenting, mechanical force. Dalton recoiled, his face pale with terror as he realized the fundamental laws of life and death he had studied held no sway over the puppets of the archmage. He stood there, frozen in a state of absolute, shattering disbelief, his mind screaming that a common skeleton should be physically incapable of moving without its head. With a slow, chilling, and deeply mocking smile, the protagonist stared him down, reminding him that he had already been warned about what was to come. As the headless monster stepped back, it reached down, calmly retrieved its own rolling skull from the dirt, and snapped it back onto its neck with the casual ease of someone adjusting a piece of armor. Cleanse explained that this terrifying, unyielding resilience was the exact reason he had managed to sweep across the entire continent in his previous life. The sight of the creature casually repairing itself with its own hands sent Dalton spiraling into a deep, primal state of terror. The former archmage peeled back the curtain, revealing the dark, underlying truth of his power. He stated clearly that spirits summoned with such raw, pure demonic energy do not abide by the fragile laws of mortal injury. They are not so easily put to rest. The remaining mercenaries were pushed well past the brink of sanity, wailing in utter despair as they finally understood that they were fighting a war against an army that simply refused to stop existing. Cleanse let out a soft sigh, noting that in his current, limited youthful body, he could only sustain 11 of these elite summons at any given time, before mockingly asking the trembling, broken men if they truly wanted to continue this pathetic farce. While the forest was being painted in dark, crimson blood, the perspective shifted to the serene, peaceful gardens of the mansion, where the commander and the little maid, Erin, were sharing a light-hearted laugh by the fountain. Erin giggled uncontrollably, imagining the wildly exaggerated stories of the young master's supposed misbehavior back at the monastery. The commander watched her with a visibly softened expression, truly touched by how much the young girl seemed to adore and admire the boy. She sat there with her cheeks hilariously stuffed with sweet treats. Nodding enthusiastically, she declared that she loved him more than anything else in the world. She asked the knight if he truly understood how incredible the young master was, describing him with complete sincerity as the absolute personification of kindness. Her sweet, innocent words created a haunting, jarring contrast to the scene unfolding miles away. Even as she called him gentle, a mercenary was currently sprinting through the dark, suffocating woods, shrieking at the top of his lungs in pure, unadulterated fear. Even as she called him sweet, a skeleton was actively cleaving through a henchman with a blade infused with jagged, dark magic. She smiled brightly, claiming he was the warmest soul in existence because he always shared his biscuits with her. At that very same moment, a cold, oppressive, and shadowy aura of death was systematically suffocating the life out of the forest. Back in the thick of the carnage, the protagonist's gaze remained cold as chips of winter ice, completely devoid of the warmth Aaron so fondly described. One of the last mercenaries let out a final, gurgling cry as a skeleton finally ended his life, leaving only the purple-haired Dalton to defend his own existence. He was panting heavily, his chest heaving and his muscles screaming from sheer exhaustion as he swung his blade in a desperate, frantic arc. He managed to land one heavy blow, but the skeleton's bones simply nipped back together in an instant. This left him in a state of absolute, crushing hopelessness. In a final fit of desperate, blind rage, Dalton realized that hacking at these mindless puppets was a fool's errand. He concluded that the only way to stop the nightmare was to take down the puppeteer himself. If he could just strike down the young master, the summons would surely dissipate into nothingness. With a raw, primal roar of pure hatred, Dalton charged directly toward Cleanse, screaming his name into the dark. He declared that this macabre game of playing with corpses ended right here, and that everything would finally be settled by the mage's own death. He raised his sword for a final, devastating overhead executioner's strike, pouring every last ounce of his remaining strength into the blow, but Cleanse didn't even flinch. The mage's eyes suddenly ignited with a brilliant, intense purple light, his magical sight predicting the exact trajectory of the attack with crystalline, terrifying clarity. To the ancient, reborn necromancer, the deadly, desperate lunge was moving at a snail's pace. A pathetic, clumsy attempt from a child who had no idea he was challenging a literal god of the afterlife. Purple energy crackled violently within Cleanse's eyes, the sparks illuminating the surrounding darkness as he tracked every single micro-movement of his opponent through his heightened mystical sight. The vast archives of his memory surged open, pulling forth a specific technique he had witnessed only once before. He recalled with absolute, haunting precision the exact trajectory and the rhythm of the swordplay his brother had displayed in the arena only days ago. Dalton's eyes widened in paralyzing, total shock as he recognized the stance his opponent was mirroring. It was the sacred hidden sword art passed down through the Rhineland family, a technique never meant to be shown lightly. Cleanse drew it out without hesitation, unleashing the terrifying meteor's sword, and in that instant, his blade flashed like a falling star as it smashed head-on into Dalton's weapon. A sharp, nauseating crack of metal split through the air. Dalton's sword could not withstand the impact at all, and the blade was cleanly cut in two, the broken half spinning away before it crashed into the dirt. Cleanse stood above his shaking opponent, his shadow falling over Dalton like a death sentence. Then his voice sank into a cold, almost frozen whisper, telling him that the real punishment had not even started yet. As the dust from their brief battle slowly drifted down and the night around them became eerily quiet, Cleanse lowered his eyes toward the defeated noble on the ground and calmly admitted that Dalton had been correct about one thing. When a summoner dies, the beings he created inevitably lose their strength. That was a fatal weakness even the mighty Ashimon had never been able to truly erase. But as Cleanse thought about it now, a strange and bitter irony settled over him. In his previous life, he had depended completely on demonic energy to fight and survive. Yet now, the martial power inherited from the Rhineland bloodline was covering the flaws that once made him vulnerable. The blood of his old enemy, flowing through the body he now possessed, had sharpened him into something even more dangerous than the archmage he used to be. Dalton lay there broken, his face twisted with confusion and fear. He tried to force out a question, but his arms and legs would not obey him, as if his entire body had become a dead weight pinned to the earth. Cleanse simply stared back at him with a chilling calm, his expression carrying both absolute certainty and bottomless contempt as he watched the life slowly drain from the boy's eyes. With one final breath, Dalton's body went limp and collapsed completely. Cleanse then lifted his gaze toward the dark horizon, quietly speaking to the lingering ghost of Burkle. He told him to wait a little longer, because this ruined family would be rebuilt by Cleanse himself, with his own two hands. Then, without warning, Dalton jolted awake. But the forest had vanished entirely, and instead he found himself sinking inside a suffocating world of absolute darkness. He tried to lift his hands in panic, only to feel the freezing bite of thick iron shackles locking him firmly in place. Terror surged through his chest when he realized where he was. His body had been strapped to a torture chair, its frame covered in cruel spikes, rusted chains, and cold metal restraints. From somewhere inside the black void, a shadowy figure slowly stepped into view and remarked in a dry, indifferent voice that their guest had finally woken up. It was Cleanse, but in this strange space, his presence felt even darker than before. He revealed that they were now in the place where souls were dragged after their light went out, a personal afterlife shaped by the will of Ashimon. Dalton's mind nearly shattered as the truth struck him. He was already dead, and his soul had been trapped inside a dimension created by the Necromancer himself. Cleanse leaned closer, his voice echoing through the darkness with the weight of countless years. He reminded Dalton of the sick pastime he had enjoyed, the countless dogs he had starved, tormented, and slaughtered without a shred of pity. He had done it for entertainment, hiding his cruelty behind the mask of noble tradition while committing one atrocity after another. Cleanse remembered the twisted delight that used to spread across Dalton's face during those hunts, and now that same memory had become the design for his punishment. Dalton screamed and demanded to be released, but his desperate voice was swallowed almost instantly by the endless abyss surrounding him. Then, in the middle of his panic, one terrible moment of clarity struck him. He remembered the sensation of Cleanse's sword piercing through him, yet somehow he was sitting here with his body seemingly intact. Cleanse answered that confusion by laying out the nightmare in front of him. Dalton was dead, there was no escaping that. The body he felt now was only a vessel prepared to receive his karma, and whether he had believed in souls or an afterlife no longer mattered at all. His debt had finally come due, and the time had arrived for him to pay for every drop of blood he had ever spilled. All the sins he thought he could leave behind had finally caught up to him, and now they had come to collect what he owed. Dalton's breath caught in a broken sob as a phantom pack of hounds began to take shape behind Cleanse, emerging from the darkness one by one. Cleanse ordered his enemy to listen, and to truly hear them this time. He told Dalton to listen to the storm of barks, growls, and snarls from the lives he had snuffed out with his own hands. Those lives had been taken for nothing more than his amusement. Then the ghostly dogs lunged forward, their spectral jaws tearing into Dalton's soul. His scream exploded through the darkness, filled with a despair so deep it felt as if his very essence was being ripped apart piece by piece. The silver-haired boy stood above him without the slightest mercy, cold and unmoving. He told Dalton to carve this pain into his memory, because this was the hell he had built with his own hands. Dalton begged for mercy again and again, but no one answered him. He was left to be torn apart by the very victims of the bloodsport he had once enjoyed. Back in the real world, Dalton's lifeless body lay sprawled across the dirt, covered in fresh wounds that mirrored the torment being inflicted on his soul. Cleanse calmly slid his blade back into its sheath, his face peaceful and undisturbed, as though he had finally removed a troublesome nuisance that had dared to disgrace him. Behind him, his skeletal legion gathered in silent, orderly rows. As Cleanse looked into the hollow eye sockets of those loyal servants, he felt a faint pull of an ancient debt he still owed them. He told the undead soldiers that they had earned a reward for answering his call across the centuries, and he promised to free them from the curse of endless servitude. A radiant emerald light spread across the clearing, washing over every skeleton, and their bodies began to break apart into glittering particles of mana. Cleanse watched them vanish into the wind in heavy silence, his thoughts drifting toward the endless cycle of life, death, and what might come after. Once again, he found himself wondering why he had been pulled back from the void in the first place. To him, true death was when bones crumbled into dust and scattered until nothing remained. And yet here he stood again, wrapped in flesh and blood as if fate had dragged him back for a reason. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted when a hooded figure stepped out from the trees. The stranger admitted, with clear surprise in his voice, that he had not expected someone so young to wield the forbidden art of necromancy. Cleanse's eyes immediately sharpened. He stared at the newcomer and questioned who he was, as well as how much of the battle he had seen. The man only gave him a cryptic, mocking smile, saying there was no need to bother with names. With a casual flick of his wrist, a sickly green aura ignited in his palm, and he began forming a spell of his own. He claimed that even if he explained his mission, a boy like Cleanse would never understand its true scale. Then, right before Cleanse's eyes, the dead mercenaries scattered across the battlefield began to twitch and rise from the ground. Their eyes burned with a dull, stagnant green glow, and their corpses moved like mindless puppets, completely controlled by the stranger's dark power. The hooded man lifted the bodies with his magic, remarking that Dalton had been a miserable failure, but the remains he left behind could still serve a useful purpose. Then, with one final cold laugh echoing through the mist, the necromancer vanished from the clearing. He disappeared along with the reanimated corpses, carrying them away into the night. Meanwhile, miles away at the mansion, the once peaceful atmosphere had already begun to turn sour. Erin, the petite maid, stood nearby and gently tried to draw the commander's attention back, urging him to listen to even more stories about the young master's reckless little antics. But the commander could not bring himself to respond. The night around him felt frozen solid, and his eyes remained fixed on the emergency scroll in his hand as a deep sense of dread tightened in his chest. No matter how hard he tried to steady himself, he could not shake the terrible feeling that something had already gone horribly wrong. 3 full hours had passed since the signal first began to feel abnormal, and by now every instinct in his body was warning him that this was not an accident, but a trap. He turned at once, intending to leave the estate and search for Cleanse himself. But before he could take another step, 2 stern castle guards moved into his path. In that instant, the tension snapped tight, and the commander realized the scheme against the young heir ran far deeper than a simple hunting trip. The mansion guards stood like stone walls in front of him, their faces cold and unreadable. In a flat voice, they warned that it would become a serious problem if the commander abandoned his post at a time like this. The knight fell into a heavy silence, his gaze sharpening as he studied their uniforms and recognized the crest of Cornwall. That family emblem was stamped clearly across their attire, and it told him everything he needed to know. Dalton's family had been spinning this web of betrayal from the very beginning, even preparing measures in case things went wrong. The commander straightened his back and slowly drew himself up to his full height, his presence growing heavier as he issued one final warning. If they tried to block his way again, he would no longer remain still and simply watch from the sidelines. Faced with the murderous pressure rolling off him, the Cornwall guards stiffened, their confidence wavering as hesitation flickered across their faces. The knight then turned toward Aaron and ordered the young maid to withdraw into the manor for safety, along with the priest who had accompanied them on this trip. But one of the guards answered with a grim look, telling him that the priest had already left long ago. The moment he heard that, the commander remembered Clin's earlier warnings, felt the danger closing in, and immediately vaulted onto his horse. With the emergency scroll clenched tightly between his teeth, he tore it apart, now certain that none of these events were happening by coincidence. He kicked his horse into a full gallop, racing toward the forest as fast as the animal could run, his heart pounding with fear over what might have already happened to his master. Deep inside the dark forest, Clin stood alone, holding his ground against the mysterious necromancer and the legion of walking corpses gathered before him. Thin streams of sweat slid down his pale face as he realized just how much demonic energy he had already burned through in the previous fight. This young body had finally reached its limit, and in his current state, he could no longer rely on his own necromancy to protect himself. The hooded sorcerer sensed that victory was within reach and immediately ordered his mindless zombies to rush the boy without mercy. The undead horde lurched forward all at once, but Cleanse only curled his lips into a faint smirk, openly mocking the necromancer. He ridiculed the man for believing he could win just by imitating the ancient arts of the past. Then, without warning, the crest on the magic scroll in Clean's hand burst open with a dazzling radiance, shining like light descending from the heavens. The zombies closing in on him shrieked and staggered backward, their decayed flesh twisting in agony as the holy brilliance tore through the darkness. Cleanse laughed at the sight and threw his taunt straight at the enemy, declaring that the necromancer was completely finished now. As the necromancer stared in confusion, the ground beneath their feet began to throb with golden divine power, rising upward in waves and devouring the surrounding shadows. From the center of that blazing light, the priest who had been traveling with the young heir finally appeared, his eyes burning with fierce golden fire. His voice rolled through the clearing like thunder as he called upon the holy light to purify the abominations before him, reducing the zombies to drifting ash in an instant. Then he calmly assured the young master that he could rest easy now, because the church would take care of everything from here. The stunned necromancer recoiled and demanded to know who this newcomer was, unable to comprehend the overwhelming holy power pouring out of him. The priest met his gaze without fear, his expression filled with unwavering resolve, and revealed himself as an exarch of the Holy Order. An exarch was no ordinary priest or battlefield cleric. They were the church's supreme human weapons, 3 chosen warriors who had sworn themselves to carrying out the absolute will of the Pope. Only they could wield the sacred weapons left behind by Saint Galagund, and people whispered that a single exarch carried the martial strength of an entire fortress. The necromancer began to tremble as the priest's holy aura pressed down on the clearing, physically crushing the darkness he had summoned. Cleanse watched quietly as the man he had known only as a simple priest revealed his true identity as the strongest in martial prowess among the chosen 3. The exarch stepped forward and placed himself before the boy like an unbreakable shield, promising to guard him from every evil that dared approach. The remaining zombies, driven by the necromancer's desperate orders, snarled and charged with savage fury, but their rotten bodies were helpless before that divine light. The exarch raised a sacred tome, pouring his power into a baptism of fire that consumed the undead on the spot. With his voice ringing across the battlefield, he commanded the sinners before him to listen and pray for their souls. Before it was too late, his words carried the weight of final judgment. Then he stomped down hard, sending a golden shockwave rippling through the earth, shattering the ground and blasting the undead puppets away like leaves caught in a violent storm. The Exarch declared that this was his mercy, a final judgment granted to souls that had already been lost and corrupted. The Necromancer was thrown backward by the sheer pressure of the attack, his thoughts spinning in disbelief at the madness of an Exarch appearing in such a remote place. He spat a curse into the wind, realizing that his carefully prepared plan had crashed straight into the most terrifying force the Holy Order could send. The hooded Necromancer spat onto the ground, his voice cracking with fear and fury as he insisted that such divine power was nothing but a grand lie. Overcome with terror, he turned his back on the clearing and tried to flee. But in the panic of his escape, his mask slipped loose and fell to the forest floor, exposing his hidden identity beneath the moonlight. Even so, he did not manage to get far. The Exarch appeared directly in his path like a vengeful god, asking in a terrifyingly calm voice where he thought he was going. The Necromancer screamed as the priest's mental pressure invaded his mind, crushing his will and leaving him gasping for air that refused to come. The sorcerer could only listen as the priest whispered that the prayer was not over yet, and that he should be grateful for the judgment the divine light was about to grant him. In the name of the Holy Order, the Exarch brought down one final purifying strike, and the Necromancer's body crumbled away into nothing more than a pile of gray ash. Cleanse stared at the execution without looking away, his attention locked completely on the brutal scene before him. Then, from the remains of the Necromancer, one loose eye rolled across the dark dirt, turning slowly until it finally came to a stop right beside his feet. He bent down and reached for it, but his mind was already elsewhere. What truly struck him was the Exarch's terrifying precision. With nothing more than a single step forward and the crushing pressure of his presence, the priest had erased more than 20 bodies in an instant, as if they had never stood there at all. That level of power was not merely strong. It was overwhelming on a scale that even Cleanse, once an archmage in his former life, could not help but acknowledge with genuine awe. Then, without warning, a hand slick with blood clamped down hard on Cleanse's shoulder, gripping him with enough force to bruise. When he turned, the one standing behind him was none other than the Exarch himself. The priest's eyes narrowed, cold and searching, as he studied Cleanse from head to toe like he was trying to peel away every layer hiding beneath the boy's skin. He said he had rushed straight to this place the very moment he sensed a violent surge of necromantic power rising from the area. But now that he was here in person, something about the situation felt wrong. Deeply wrong. His fingers pressed harder into Cleanse's shoulder as he pointed out that the deathly aura he had detected did not appear to belong to the boy standing in front of him. And yet, that aura had definitely come from this exact location. The Exarch's gaze sharpened with suspicion, so piercing it felt like a blade against the skin, and Cleanse felt the air around him grow unbearably tense. In that instant, Cleanse understood just how close he was to the edge, as if one careless breath could send him falling into disaster. He knew that if he moved the wrong way, or let even one dangerous word slip from his mouth, this holy man would kill him on the spot without the slightest hesitation. But before the pressure could crush him completely, the standoff was suddenly broken by the thunderous pounding of hooves as the commander came charging into the scene. The commander shouted Cleanse's name, his voice sharp with panic and urgency as he raced toward him. The moment Cleanse saw his guard arrive so quickly, a small flicker of relief passed through him, even if his face barely had the strength to show it. But the knight had finally pushed him past his limit. Every hidden strain, every ounce of pressure his young body had endured, began to crash down on him all at once. Even drawing out a small fragment of the necromancy he had once controlled so easily had been far too much for the fragile body he now possessed. His legs gave out beneath him, and the forest spun as the ground tilted upward in his vision. Before Cleanse could collapse into the dirt, the commander threw himself down from his horse and caught his young master firmly in his arms. The knight held him with desperate concern, asking again and again what had happened. Cleanse, barely able to keep his voice steady, only whispered that his strength had simply left him. When the commander pressed him about what became of the hunting party, Cleanse answered with chilling calm. Dalton had attacked him in the chaos of battle, and Cleanse had eliminated him there. Not far away, a lone white flower stood in the darkness, its pale petals now dotted with crimson blood. It swayed softly in the cold forest wind, as if the night itself had gone silent around it. The story then returned to the mansion, where a fierce inquiry had already begun behind closed doors. The news of Dalton's death had struck the room like a bolt of lightning. Count Delkin Cornwell, Dalton's father, slammed both fists onto the table, his face twisted with blind fury. He refused to accept it. In his eyes, Dalton was an honorable knight, loyal and disciplined, and he insisted that his son would never attempt to assassinate the heir of the ducal family. An investigator stepped in before the count's anger could spiral any further, placing a document before him and revealing that 20 of the count's own mercenaries had been confirmed at the scene. For a brief moment, the count's face lost its color as the evidence landed in front of him. His men had been exposed, but he quickly forced himself to recover and shifted to another excuse. He argued that the story made no sense from the beginning. Dalton was a trained warrior, while everyone knew Cleanse had no mana and was supposedly helpless in a real fight. Cornered and desperate to protect both his name and his family's honor, the Count began attacking Cleanse instead, dragging out the strange rumors that had always surrounded the boy's late mother. He accused Cleanse of hiring an assassin to murder Dalton, then twisting the entire incident so that Dalton would be blamed for the crime. Just as the Count's accusations grew more furious, a commanding voice cut through the room from the entrance, powerful enough to silence the chaos, ordering him to shut his mouth. Cleanse stepped into the room with a dry smirk touching his lips, glancing across the gathered nobles as if their words had already exhausted his patience. He remarked that there truly seemed to be no limit to the nonsense they were willing to say. He made his position clear without trembling or hesitation. He had acted to defend himself, and the priest had helped him face the real enemy at the scene, the Necromancer. When the Count snapped back and called him a liar, Cleanse met his gaze head-on with a stare as firm as iron. A faint mocking pink light flickered in his eyes, and with a thin, ironic smile, he asked whether they had now decided as fact that he was Asha'man. The Count suddenly felt a suffocating pressure settle over him as Cleanse reminded everyone in the room of the vow he had made at the very moment he ended Dalton's life. It was a solemn oath to rebuild the crumbling foundations of the Rhineland family with his own hands. His voice was low, cold, and filled with unshakable conviction as he declared that he would restore the family himself, and that he would no longer allow vermin to stand in his way. The oppressive silence in the room was suddenly sliced apart by a sharp knock at the door. A blonde woman stepped inside, and the moment she entered, her presence seemed to still the very air around her. She was the commander of the Blue Spear Holy Knights, and her arrival immediately sent a quiet ripple of unease through everyone gathered there. Cleanse recognized her at once. She was the same woman who had appeared during the sword exhibition, watching everything from the shadows without drawing attention to herself. When one of the nobles questioned what right she had to involve herself, the investigator quickly explained that Dalton had carried out many missions for her order in the past, which gave her every reason to seek the truth. Her eyes settled on Cleanse, sharp and analytical, as if she were measuring something hidden deep inside him. That look alone made the ancient mage within him instinctively raise his guard. She wasted no time on polite greetings or unnecessary words. Instead, she directly asked for a private meeting with the young master. The investigator hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure whether allowing it was wise, but in the end he permitted it and warned Cleanse not to take too long. As Cleanse followed her away from the crowded room and toward a more secluded place, his thoughts moved quickly through every possible reason she might have approached him. He knew this was not a simple courtesy visit. At best, she was here to confirm a suspicion. At worst, she was preparing to test him in a way that could become dangerous. Still, Cleanse did not shrink back. Whatever her purpose was, he decided that her family, the House of Forivern, could become a useful stepping stone in the larger designs he intended to build. They entered a private study, and once the door closed behind them, the commander turned toward him. Her calm voice, strangely smooth and alluring, broke the silence between them. Then, without any warning, she moved in and pressed Cleanse against the wall, her eyes locked tightly onto his as she leaned close and whispered a request he had not expected. She wanted to touch him, because only then could she see the truth for herself. This woman was the eldest daughter of the House of Forivern, one of the three great legendary pillars that supported the continent. Cleanse immediately remembered the frightening reputation attached to her name. The records told of her battles against savage orcs, where her blue eyes would shine with lethal intensity while she swept through the battlefield with her spear, moving as if death itself followed the arc of her blade. She was a living legend, a warrior who had single-handedly destroyed high-level monster orders and stood alone among mountains of corpses as the unquestioned protector of the civilians. Back in the present, that same intimidating pressure still hung around her like a sharpened blade, even while she looked at Cleanse with a teasing smile, as if she was enjoying every second of his discomfort. When Cleanse hesitated and failed to answer right away, her expression cooled instantly. She snapped at him to stop acting as though the two of them were close enough to play around like family. She reminded him that although there was a distant family connection between them, it meant very little. She was the daughter of the first wife, while Cleanse came from another branch entirely, and because they shared no true blood, she felt no family duty to restrain her curiosity around him. Before Cleanse could fully respond, the commander shoved him back against the wall again, pinning him there with firm, unyielding strength as she demanded that he show her his hands. Cleanse shouted in confusion, asking what she thought she was doing, but she paid no attention to his protest at all, as if his resistance was nothing more than background noise. She reached out and took his hand into hers, her touch strangely delicate yet impossible to escape, carefully feeling the shape and texture of his skin. Then she spoke her conclusion aloud. His hands were soft, almost like a baby's, with none of the rough calluses, cuts, or hardened scars that should belong to someone trained seriously in the sword. Her fingers moved along his tendons with calm, clinical precision, tracing each line as she leaned closer. Her face drew near enough that Cleanse could feel the warmth of her breath brushing against him. Then she raised her eyes to meet his directly and asked the question that cut straight to the center of everything. If his hands carried no proof of sword mastery, then what kind of power had he actually used to slaughter Dalton and 20 hardened mercenaries? Cleanse immediately shoved her away and stepped back, putting space between them as a cold bead of sweat formed at the back of his neck. At that moment, he understood that this woman might be even more dangerous than the priests who had already cornered him. She was not trying to force a confession out of him with direct threats. She was watching for the smallest reaction. Cleanse knew that in her world, silence could be treated as an admission, and even a moment of hesitation could become proof. So instead of backing down, he chose to strike first. A mocking smile spread across his face as he asked her directly what she would do if he really was the legendary Archmage Ashamon. But the response he received was completely outside his expectations. She suddenly burst into laughter, loud and unrestrained. She looked him over from head to toe, clearly amused, and told him that a little pipsqueak like him could never possibly be the terrifying demon king from the old stories. That single insult struck Cleanse harder than any sword or fist could have. He froze where he stood, his mouth slightly open, repeating the word pipsqueak to himself in stunned disbelief. He, the most feared necromancer in history, had just been mocked for being short. He even asked whether she might have made some kind of mistake, but the grin on her face did not change at all. She confirmed it without a shred of hesitation, and even looked ready to say it again, just to annoy him further. Then she called him pipsqueak once more, and Cleanse felt his temper flare from the sheer humiliation of it. Deep down, he knew her judgment about his current body's height was not exactly wrong, but that did nothing to soften the blow. His dignity as the former Demon King had been shaken to its core, and as if the situation was not already absurd enough, the commander suddenly made an even bolder proposal. She told him that if he could defeat a knight without using a sword or relying on his necromancy, then she would give him a kiss. Cleanse was left completely speechless, staring at her as his mind struggled to process the outrageous offer she had just thrown at him. Between the injuries inside his body and the sheer strangeness of the conversation, Cleanse found it almost impossible to judge the situation with a clear head. He wondered if this was some twisted political maneuver, a strange attempt at bribery, or something even more unpredictable. Meanwhile, she turned her gaze toward the horizon and casually noted that it was getting late, meaning she needed to return to the meeting. Before leaving, she added one final remark that sounded almost like a challenge. The legendary Archmage would never have been as reckless, or as boldly foolish, as the boy standing before her now. When the two of them stepped back into the meeting hall, every gaze in the room immediately shifted toward them, filled with sharp curiosity and suspicion. Cleanse quietly admitted to himself that he had been far too complacent. He had underestimated just how deep and filthy the political swamp around this family truly was. He understood now that the nobles would never honestly accept the idea that a boy with no mana had killed the count's son purely in self-defense. When the investigator pressed him about what had happened during the private conversation, Cleanse ignored the question completely. Instead, he walked straight toward a sword resting against the wall, seized the hilt, and drove the blade down into the floor with a violent thud, shocking everyone into silence and forcing the entire room to look at him. The gathered nobles stared without a word as Cleanse slowly turned and fixed his attention on Count Delkin Cornwell. He challenged the Count to prove his accusations right there, in front of everyone, and settle the question of his innocence once and for all. Cleanse invoked the old northern tradition of trial by combat, a brutal and lawless duel where the winner would be declared innocent, while the loser would be branded guilty. The Count stared at him in stunned disbelief, wondering for a moment whether the boy had finally lost what little sense he had. Trial by combat was a savage relic from the past, a fight with no proper restrictions and no safe path for the weak. But after the first wave of shock faded, the Count quickly realized that this madness might actually be the perfect opportunity. If he could drag the dispute out of the inquiry and into the arena, then he could bury the evidence about his mercenaries together with Cleanse's corpse. With a predatory smile spreading across his face, the Count accepted the challenge. He announced that he would appoint a champion to fight in his place, and swore that this duel would end with the boy's death. Cleanse only smiled back, completely unshaken, and declared that he would be the one to bring the Count's bloodline to an end. With the duel now set for 4 days later, Cleanse knew this was only the opening move. He intended to use the Count as a stepping stone, to show every bastard within the family exactly who he was, then tear the rotten house apart and rebuild it in his own image. Later, in a private wing of the mansion, Cleanse's older half-brother Delon finally exploded with fury. He shouted that the challenge was complete madness, demanding to know whether Cleanse understood that he had just gambled with his own life. Cleanse, already exhausted from being lectured again and again, told him flatly that he knew exactly what he had done and was tired of hearing the same warning repeated. Delon said their father had already granted permission for the duel, but even then, he desperately offered to take Clen's place as the champion. Clen's refused him immediately, without even taking a moment to consider it. Delon argued that as the future ruler of the North, it was his duty to protect his younger brother, no matter what danger stood in front of them. Then, in a rare moment where his anger gave way to raw emotion, Delon remembered the very first time he had seen Clen's as a baby. To him, that tiny infant had looked like a beautiful angel, and ever since then, he had spent 7 long years waiting for Clen's to return from the monastery. With tears shining in his eyes, Delon grabbed Clen's and begged him to reconsider, his voice shaking as he desperately tried to stop his brother from walking toward what he believed was certain death. Their emotional confrontation was suddenly interrupted when a guard hurried into the room, bringing urgent news. Count Delkin Cornwell had already selected the champion who would fight in his place. Clen slipped free from his brother's hold, pulling his arm back with a sharp, controlled motion. His face hardened, and in a cold, steady voice, he asked exactly who he was supposed to face in the arena. The guard answered without delay, revealing the opponent's name, Randall. He was an excommunicated knight, a man whose name had become feared across battlefields because of the brutal reputation he had carved out with his own hands. The moment Randall's name was spoken, the scene shifted to a filthy, shadowed tavern. Its doors creaked open, and standing there was an enormous, muscle-bound man, his eyes burning with raw savagery, like a beast barely pretending to be human. Randall had once belonged to the knightly orders, but even they had thrown him away. His bloodlust was simply too extreme, because once violence took hold of him, he could not control the urge to slaughter everything around him. Inside the ruined tavern, Randall sat surrounded by shattered tables, splintered chairs, and bodies collapsed across the floor. With a terrifying glare twisting his face, he drank a deep, blood-red liquor straight from a wooden bucket, like some kind of monster celebrating a massacre. Then Randall muttered under his breath that it had been far too long since he had heard a young boy scream. The way his lips curled made it clear he was not simply waiting for a duel. He was savoring the slaughter before it even began. Back at the manor, Clen's quietly absorbed every word about the opponent waiting for him. His eyes gradually sharpened, and the childish softness on his face gave way to a grim, unwavering resolve. At that moment, a man came toward Clen's carrying a sword carefully wrapped in cloth. He held it out with both hands, his expression serious, as if the weapon itself came with a warning. He told Clen's that this was the sword he had requested, forged exactly according to his instructions. But his voice turned cautious as he warned him that if this blade clashed even once against a sword infused with mana, it would break apart instantly. Clen's accepted the sword without making a sound, feeling its weight settle into his hands. He lowered his gaze and carefully examined the blade, as if confirming whether it matched the plan he already had in mind. After only a brief inspection, Clen's gave his answer without the slightest hesitation. It was good enough, and since everything was ready, they would head out immediately. By that same time, the arena had already been swallowed by excitement. People had gathered from every direction, filling the space with restless noise and eager expectation. Everywhere in the crowd, people were whispering about the same shocking news. Clen's had finally chosen to appear in person. The air buzzed with curiosity, and countless eyes turned toward the battlefield, waiting to see what the mannerless young lord would do. High above the arena, the nobles sat in their elevated seats, watching the scene below from a comfortable distance. One of them glanced toward Clen's father with visible surprise and remarked that he had not expected him to come out personally. Then the noble turned slightly toward him again, a faint smile resting on his face. He asked if Clen's father was truly comfortable with this decision, reminding him that his own champion was a knight from the Empire, and that such an opponent might be far too much for a son without mana. With a smooth, almost mocking tone, he added that it was still not too late to send out Lord Delane instead. But Clen's father did not react at all. His face remained calm, his posture unmoved, and his silence made it seem as though his decision had already been settled long before anyone tried to question it. Meanwhile, Clen's kept walking toward the arena floor. His eyes moved carefully over the surroundings, taking in the stands, the battlefield, and the heavy attention pressing down on him from every side. As he looked around, Clen's wondered where his opponent was. The duel was about to begin, yet the man he was supposed to fight still had not appeared in front of him. But in the very next instant, a huge shadow suddenly covered him from above. A massive man stepped forward, his frame so large and imposing that he looked less like a knight and more like a living monster. The man's body seemed as hard as steel, with thick muscles pressing against his clothes as if every part of him had been built only for violence and battle. Then, with a slow and heavy motion, he placed one large hand directly on top of Clen's head. Looking down at him with an intimidating grin, the man asked if he was Lord Clen's. The terrifying man standing before Cleanse was none other than Cornwell's champion, Randall. He stared down at the boy with a cruel smile stretching across his face, then mocked him by saying he was much younger than he had heard. Randall's gaze slid toward Cleanse's arms, and his grin deepened. He remarked that those arms were so thin, then leaned in closer, his narrowed eyes gleaming with a dangerous kind of amusement. He wondered aloud what kind of sound Cleanse would make once his neck snapped, and the instant Cleanse realized what Randall was doing, his body reacted before anything else. Cleanse sprang backward with startling speed, putting distance between them in one clean motion. In the blink of an eye, he had already escaped from under Randall's hand. The sudden movement sent a wave of shock through the audience. Murmurs broke out from every direction as people asked what they had just seen, and whether Cleanse had actually launched himself backward like that. Up in the stands, the same nobleman from earlier looked back toward Cleanse's father, clearly entertained by what had happened. With amusement in his voice, he asked if his grace had seen it too, saying that Cleanse was already reacting like this before the duel had even begun, and wondering whether someone like him could truly handle Randall. Down below, Randall let out a low, rough laugh. Seeing Cleanse back away like that, he sneered and said the boy already looked completely terrified. But Cleanse's thoughts were nothing like what Randall imagined. As he stared at the massive knight with caution, he silently cursed, realizing that it was not fear at all, he had simply been startled. The sensation had reminded him of the last time that priest suddenly grabbed his shoulder. For a split second, Cleanse had retreated without thinking, and even now he could not help blaming that useless bastard for haunting him right until the end. At the same time, far above the arena floor, Captain Leia Ren stood silently watching the entire confrontation unfold beneath her. Her sharp eyes stayed locked on Cleanse without drifting away even once. As the tension in the arena grew heavier, she studied every movement he made. Just then, a guard hurried over to her side, clearly anxious. He warned her that Lady Helion would be furious if she discovered this, and urged the captain to return at once. But Leia answered without even turning her head, coldly saying she did not care, because that woman was not her mother anyway. Deep in her thoughts, another idea quietly surfaced. If Cleanse actually managed to defeat that knight, she would give him her lips. Even after that thought crossed her mind, her eyes never left the battlefield below, because there was also something she needed to confirm. Meanwhile, in the center of the arena, Cleanse stood beneath the weight of countless stares. Every whisper, every gaze, and every bit of attention seemed to press down on him at once. Embarrassment crept across his face as he thought about how humiliating the situation looked. Trying to recover his composure, he straightened himself awkwardly and spoke as if nothing had happened, saying that he had been suffering from a stiff neck lately. His voice carried clear irritation as he forced himself to look calm. Then Cleanse warned Randall not to touch his shoulder. But instead of backing off, Randall slowly reached his hand forward again, deliberately moving as if he wanted to provoke another reaction. The moment Cleanse saw that hand coming toward him, annoyance flashed across his face. He snapped that he had already told Randall not to touch him, calling him a perverted bastard and asking if even his ears were packed with muscle. Then he added that this was exactly the reason the Empire had abandoned him. For one brief moment, the entire arena seemed to freeze. Then Randall's expression shifted, and a savage grin slowly spread across his face. In a low, dangerous voice, Randall said that was excellent. The dirtier Cleanse's mouth was now, the more satisfyingly he would make him scream with it later. The instant Randall finished speaking, he lunged forward and threw a crushing punch straight at Cleanse. His massive fist tore through the air with monstrous force, carrying enough power to smash an ordinary man into the ground in a single blow. But at that exact moment, Cleanse remained strangely calm. Instead of panicking, he simply moved his hands to his coat and began unbuttoning it. Then, in the next second, a thunderous boom erupted across the arena as Randall's fist slammed down into the floor. The impact struck like an explosion, shattering the stone beneath him. Dust and fragments burst upward, and cracks spread violently across the arena floor from the point of the blow. But Randall's eyes widened in surprise. When he looked at his hand, the only thing he had managed to grab was Cleanse's coat. Cleanse himself was no longer there. He had already slipped away from the spot before Randall's devastating attack could land. The audience immediately erupted into chaos, their voices rising all at once. Some stared at the ruined floor in disbelief, shouting that the ground itself had been shattered. Others could not help asking what kind of terrifying power that was. Then someone suddenly pointed across the arena, telling everyone to look in the opposite direction. All eyes quickly turned, and there, standing at a safe distance on the far side of the arena, was Cleanse. He now held a short sword in his hand, his posture guarded and ready. Cleanse kept his gaze fixed on Randall, his expression tight with caution. After seeing that destructive punch up close, he could only think that this bastard truly had one vicious temper. Deep inside, Cleanse stayed surprisingly calm as he measured Randall from head to toe. Just as he had expected, facing that monster head-on was going to be extremely difficult. If even one blow from Randall's massive body landed cleanly, Cleanse knew he would be the one sent flying apart. He hated having to admit it, but this was not the kind of opponent he could treat lightly or toy with. Meanwhile, the spectators around the arena kept whispering among themselves, their voices filled with nervous disbelief as they stared at the huge gap in raw power between the two fighters. Some admitted Cleanse had dodged the attack well, but they still could not understand how he was supposed to defeat a monster like Randall. Another man nearby swallowed hard, his face pale, as he spoke in disbelief. He said that even a single graze from a punch like that would be enough to shatter Cleanse's bones. Around him, more spectators continued murmuring uneasily, convinced that Cleanse was simply walking straight toward his own death. Nearby, Cleanse's friend could not help calling out his name. At that same moment, the words Cleanse had said earlier resurfaced in his mind. If he took Cleanse's place in the trial by combat, it would only give their enemies a legal excuse to kill the Rhineland heir. As that warning echoed in his head, he silently accepted that Cleanse had been right. With the fate of the family hanging in the balance, he could not simply act on impulse. But before that thought could fully settle, the battle on the arena floor had already moved forward without waiting for anyone to catch their breath. Randall suddenly burst forward with terrifying speed, his huge body crossing the distance in an instant like a charging beast. Cleanse reacted immediately, drawing his sword and launching his own attack before Randall could completely overwhelm him. But Randall stopped the blade casually with only his bare hand, as if Cleanse's strike were nothing more than a harmless toy. The unbelievable force behind that simple movement left everyone watching in shock. In the very next moment, Randall struck back with brutal power, and the impact forced Cleanse to slide backward across the arena floor. But Randall had no intention of giving him even a single second to breathe or regain his footing. With overwhelming speed, he appeared in front of Cleanse again almost instantly and continued attacking, each movement fierce, relentless, and filled with crushing pressure. As he pressed forward, Randall sneered at him, mocking Cleanse by asking whether he truly thought he could win this fight just by dodging. Cleanse used every bit of strength he had just to block and deflect the incoming blows. Each strike slammed down heavier than the one before, forcing him further back step by step. Randall kept ridiculing him without mercy, asking why he did not simply use his necromancy. After all, wasn't he supposed to be the great Ashaman? But the moment Randall looked directly into Cleanse's eyes, he suddenly noticed something strange there. Cleanse was smiling. It was not a cheerful smile, and it was not the relaxed confidence of someone enjoying the fight. It was a tight, irritated smile, the kind that hid a deep, suppressed rage. Inside his mind, Cleanse's anger clenched like a fist. This was becoming seriously annoying, and for one brief moment, he wondered if he should simply use necromancy and kill every last one of them. After sensing that overwhelming pressure, Randall's instincts reacted before his pride could stop him, and he actually stepped back in fear. Sweat began running down Randall's face as his body trembled with a fear his mind had not yet fully understood. Something about Cleanse had struck him deeper than any blade. The arrogance and confidence Randall had shown until now began to crack. In the stands, confused voices spread immediately, with people asking if Randall had just dodged, while others refused to believe it and insisted he must have been going easy on Cleanse. But Randall himself knew that was not true. Inside his own mind, he was struggling to make sense of what had just happened and silently questioned what that sensation had been. There had definitely been nothing visible in front of him. Cleanse had not made any obvious move, and yet Randall had felt an intense aura of death rising from somewhere deep inside him. It was not something Randall could see with his eyes, but every instinct in his body screamed at him to stay away. That invisible pressure alone was enough to send fear crawling through his entire body. Seeing Randall suddenly retreat, the man seated above the arena clicked his tongue in open irritation. Unable to hide his frustration, he shouted down, demanding to know what was going on and why Randall was acting like that. At that moment, Cleanse calmly stepped forward and spoke clearly enough for everyone in the arena to hear. He told them not to worry, because he would not use anything like necromancy, and the reason was simple: he was a Rhineland. This was a place where one had to prove himself with a sword alone. After a brief pause, Cleanse's voice grew even firmer as he declared once again that he would not rely on necromancy. The instant those words rang out, shock spread through the entire arena like a wave. Cleanse's father, his friend, and nearly everyone in the audience stared at him in disbelief. No one had expected him to make such a declaration, especially when so many people had been looking at him with suspicion because of his necromancy. But hearing Cleanse say those words with his own mouth began to change the atmosphere completely. The crowd's doubts slowly shifted, and little by little, voices of support started rising around the arena. People began shouting that this was exactly what a trial by combat should be. They cheered for him, promised their support, and admitted that maybe his resolve had not been a bluff after all. The arena that had once been filled with doubt and mockery was gradually taken over by excitement, all because of Cleanse's unwavering declaration. Randall poured even more mana into his blade, and the energy around the sword grew sharper, denser, and heavier, as if the weapon itself were preparing to tear through the air. Staring straight at Cleanse, Randall muttered with confidence that Brad had no mana. And in that moment, the reason Imperial swordsmanship was feared throughout the Empire became clear. The true strength of Imperial swordsmanship came from releasing mana without holding anything back. By pushing every sense to the absolute limit, breathing, muscles, blood flow, and reflexes, a swordsman could unleash one explosive burst of power, fast enough to hunt down an opponent in a single instant. Randall gathered all of that strength into one devastating strike, then rushed forward with incredible speed, his blade cutting toward Cleanse like a killing blow. His entire focus narrowed to one purpose: end the fight immediately with that single attack. But at that exact moment, Cleanse dodged with calm precision. As his eyes followed Randall's movement, he quietly said that he could see it. Randall's technique, the amount of mana he carried, even the path his blade would trace through the air, every detail had become clear to Cleanse. To him, Randall's attacks were now painfully easy to read. They looked no more threatening than the movements of a damn fly. Those words only poured more fuel onto Randall's anger, making the veins in his face tighten as his fury surged higher. Once again, Randall gathered every ounce of strength in his body and launched another attack. This time, the force behind it was even greater than before, nearly twice as powerful as the previous strike. The moment the attack crashed down, a massive explosion erupted across the arena floor. Dust and mist blasted outward in every direction, swallowing the battlefield and turning the arena into a thick, blinding cloud. The audience could barely make out anything through the haze created by that violent impact, and everyone strained their eyes to see what had happened. Randall's eyes widened in disbelief as realization struck him. In that short amount of time, Cleanse had actually read every single trajectory of his sword. Then, all of a sudden, Cleanse appeared behind him. Moving soundlessly through the smoke, Cleanse slipped directly into Randall's blind spot and prepared to counter. With a body that large, Randall's back was completely exposed, and in the next instant, Cleanse struck. The timing was flawless. His movement, precision, and smooth control were so clean that everyone watching was left frozen in stunned silence. Even the experienced warriors in the arena could hardly believe what they had just witnessed with their own eyes. Meanwhile, deep inside Randall's head, his thoughts were spinning wildly, unable to accept what his own eyes had just seen. None of it made sense to him, no matter how he tried to understand it. The situation felt completely impossible. That bastard clearly had no mana at all, so Randall couldn't understand how he was still moving like that, much less using techniques that should have been impossible for someone in his condition. Not far from the duel, one of the soldiers standing beside Leia Ren stared at the battlefield with wide eyes, his voice filled with disbelief as he turned toward her and asked if she had really just seen what happened. At that same moment, Leia Ren herself stood there with a faint blush rising across her cheeks, her gaze fixed on Cleanse as he fought. The confidence in his movements and the overwhelming skill he displayed in front of everyone had clearly shaken her more than she wanted to admit. After that, the scene shifted away from the battlefield and into another place, where a heavy, suffocating silence hung over the room. In the center of that tense atmosphere, a calm voice spoke out, but beneath that calmness was a frustration that could not be hidden. Normally, he said, he would have stepped in himself before anyone else even had the chance to react. Another man quickly tried to respond, calling out to him as, "Your Grace," but before he could finish, the protagonist's father cut him off. In a low, restrained voice, he said he already knew. He understood that he could not allow his personal feelings to guide his actions. If he stepped forward now, the prestige of the Rhineland family would only sink even lower. His expression darkened further as he added that the opponent standing before Cleanse was a knight from the Empire. In his eyes, Cleanse had absolutely no chance of winning against someone like that. Hearing those words, the other man looked deeply troubled, then carefully asked why he had allowed the duel to happen in the first place. For a brief moment, the protagonist's father said nothing, as though years of regret were pressing down on his chest all at once. Then, with a heavy voice, he finally answered. Cleanse had stepped forward to defend the honor of his late mother. Guilt weighed on every word as he admitted that even when Cleanse had been falsely branded as Ashamon and locked away in the monastery, he had not been able to save him. His hands slowly curled into fists as he asked what right he had to stop him now. The air in the room grew even heavier after that. Then, almost bitterly, he continued, saying that in the end, he could not protect anything at all. Not his own child, and not even his family. The pain in those words was impossible to miss, and the other man immediately tried to comfort him, telling him that he did not need to worry. He then looked at him firmly, and said that the young master was not the kind of person who would throw himself into a battle he had no chance of winning. Right after those words, the scene returned once again to the present battlefield, where the duel was still unfolding before everyone's eyes. The fight had not ended yet, but even Cleanse's father could no longer hide the shock spreading through his eyes as he watched what was happening in front of him. At the same time, The true history and nature of the Rhineland family's swordsmanship began to become clear. The Rhineland family had long been known as the swordsmanship family of the North. In order to survive the merciless frozen lands, they had created a sword style that pushed mana consumption down to the absolute minimum. Every step, every swing, and every shift of the body was refined for efficiency, allowing them to conserve both strength and mana while enduring long battles across brutal icy fields. Imperial swordsmanship, however, stood on the complete opposite side. It was not built around endurance or restraint. It was like predation given form. That swordsmanship existed for one purpose: to dominate the opponent completely and leave them no room to fight back. By unleashing a massive amount of mana in a single overwhelming rush, Imperial swordsmanship crushed the enemy before they even had time to react or regain their footing. But Rhineland swordsmanship followed an entirely different path, one that was quieter, sharper, and far more patient. Its focus was on waiting for the perfect opening, moving with precision, and striking only when the moment was certain, all while using the smallest amount of mana possible. That was the true essence of the Rhineland family's techniques. It was a supreme swordsmanship built on maximum efficiency, achieving the greatest result with the least possible mana. As that realization spread across the battlefield, Clens stood facing Randall directly, his posture steady and his voice calm as he finally spoke. He said this was exactly how someone like him, a person without mana, could still use his family's techniques. His eyes did not waver even under the pressure pouring from Randall. The technique might lack raw power, but against a man like Randall, it was still more than enough to beat him down. The instant those words reached Randall's ears, his face twisted with rage. Thick veins stood out across his expression as he glared at Clens with pure fury, unable to tolerate being looked down on like that. Randall spat out the words through clenched teeth, calling him a little rat. At the same time, an overwhelming force suddenly began gathering through Randall's entire body. Mana surged violently around him, growing thicker, heavier, and more suffocating with every passing second. It was obvious to everyone watching that Randall was preparing to pour every ounce of mana he possessed into one single, devastating attack. From above, the man observing the duel noticed the change immediately, his eyes locking onto Randall the moment that dangerous power began to swell. His eyes widened slightly as the thought crossed his mind. This was it. Randall was finally using it. It was Randall's secret technique, a mana burst powerful enough to seal an opponent's movements in an instant. The pressure across the battlefield kept rising without pause, and the air itself seemed to grow heavier as Randall's power climbed higher and higher. Then Randall roared in fury, refusing to be mocked any longer. He shouted that Clens should not make him laugh, because he was the one who would win this duel. In the very next instant, Randall exploded forward with terrifying speed, closing the distance between himself and Clens almost at once. His attack came crashing down with monstrous force, carrying enough power to crush his opponent in a single blow. But at the final possible moment, Clens did not panic, hesitate, or retreat. With perfect timing, he raised his sword and met Randall's attack head-on, stopping the strike directly in front of him. However, there was one thing everyone still remembered about that sword, a warning that had been given at the very beginning of the duel. The moment that blade clashed against a sword filled with mana, it was guaranteed to shatter. And just as everyone had been warned, the instant Clens blocked Randall's mana-charged attack, cracks shot across the blade. In the next moment, the sword broke apart completely, sending sharp fragments scattering through the air. Seeing the blade shatter, Randall immediately curled his lips into a victorious smirk, convinced that the duel had finally turned in his favor. He sneered that it served Clens right, and began to say that with this, his sword was finished. But before Randall could even complete the sentence, Clens suddenly smiled. Clens answered in a calm voice, saying that now, at last, it was finally complete. This was the weapon meant to hunt him. For a brief moment, Randall froze, unable to understand what Clens was talking about. Then, before Randall could make sense of it, Clens moved. In an instant, he stepped forward. Rather than treating the shattered sword as something useless, Clens used the broken blade itself like a short mana blade, perfectly suited for close-range combat. Before Randall could properly react, Clens slipped straight into his range and struck from point-blank distance. A sharp slash flashed across the battlefield in an instant. Randall's arm was severed cleanly from his body. The cut limb spun through the air as blood scattered everywhere, and Randall's face twisted into complete shock and unbearable agony. A horrifying scream tore from his throat as he staggered and collapsed backward. At that moment, a loud voice rang out across the battlefield, declaring that the duel was over. Among the people watching, one man stood frozen in disbelief as he stared at the scene before him. Just as the young master had said, Rhineland swordsmanship could be performed with only minimal mana, but that should have been something only a seasoned knight could manage. Yet Clens had executed everything flawlessly, from the movement of his feet to the exact path of his sword. And beyond that, he had intentionally lured Randall into breaking his blade. Also, he could create the perfect chance to attack at point-blank range. No matter how the man looked at it, he could barely believe what he had just witnessed with his own eyes. This was not luck, and it was not a desperate gamble. This was the young master's perfect victory. On the battlefield, Randall continued screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice shaking with pain after losing his arm. Immediately, a group of healers rushed toward him in a panic, shouting for someone to hurry and stop the bleeding before it was too late. The healers shouted in panic, telling the others to quickly pin Randall's arm down and cast sleep magic before he lost control from the pain. In just a few seconds, the entire area around him descended into chaos as they desperately tried to stop the bleeding and keep him alive. Meanwhile, Clem stood a short distance away, calmly watching the frantic scene unfold in front of him. Then, in an almost casual voice, he asked whether the severed arm could still be reattached. But despite how calm he sounded, the faint disappointment on his face was obvious. After checking the severity of Randall's injury, the healers quickly answered that it could not be reattached with ordinary methods. They said only basic healing magic could be used for now, and that Randall would have to prepare for a prosthetic arm afterward. Hearing that, Clem simply gave a quiet response, as if the result was far less impressive than he had expected. At the same time, deep inside his thoughts, Clem silently reflected that even after 200 years, healing magic had not improved very much at all. Then, from the other side of the battlefield, his father called out to him with a serious look in his eyes. His father asked whether Clem truly felt nothing after seeing a severed limb right in front of him. The moment those words reached Clem, his expression shifted slightly, as if he had suddenly remembered something important. Right, Clem reminded himself inwardly. At this moment, he was not Ashamon, and he could not afford to behave as if this kind of bloodshed was completely normal to him. After that, Clem quietly turned and began walking away from the scene, acting as though the duel had already reached its natural end. As he moved forward with the same calm steps, he wondered to himself whether he should at least pretend to be frightened now. But at that very moment, the true mastermind behind the entire incident finally stepped forward. His face was twisted with anger and disbelief as he shouted that it made no sense for Randall to lose, then raged about how much money he had spent to hire that night. Before he could continue throwing out his anger, Clem's father suddenly spoke from behind him in a cold, commanding voice and called him by name, Count Delkin Cornwell. Delkin immediately turned toward him, and Clem's father continued, reminding him that, as agreed, he had to admit his wrongdoing and fulfill the demands of the winner. Count Delkin Cornwell's expression twisted with frustration and desperation. He argued that he had lost his son and even his exclusive knight, so how could he possibly accept something like this? But before Delkin could even finish his sentence, something horrifying seemed to happen. In a single instant, it looked as if his head had been sliced clean off from his body, and for that split second, everyone around him froze in stunned silence. Then the focus fell on Clem, whose eyes had turned cold and completely emotionless as he stared straight at Delkin Cornwell and called his name. In the next moment, the truth became clear. Delkin Cornwell was still alive, and his head had never actually been cut from his body. Even so, his entire body trembled violently as he frantically grabbed at his neck again and again, unable to understand what he had just experienced. It had only been an illusion, born from the terrifying pressure of Clem's power. But to Delkin, that illusion had felt completely real. Panic exploded through his mind as he wondered what had just happened, certain that his neck had truly been cut. Sweat poured down his face, and fear swallowed him whole. Clem then stepped directly in front of him, his presence pressing down like a blade, and spoke in a voice so cold it sent chills through everyone nearby. As the victor of the duel, Clem commanded him to confess his sins before the Master of the North, then kneel and beg for forgiveness. His voice grew even heavier, sinking into the air like a death sentence, as though the words themselves carried the weight of the grave. Clem told him to lower his head and plead for mercy, because he would be crushed beneath the weight of his own sins and forced to repent. The moment those words entered Delkin Cornwell's ears, true terror took over his entire body. In that instant, Delkin almost felt as if death itself were standing directly above his head, looking down at him with cold, merciless eyes. His body shook so hard, he could barely remain upright. Cold sweat dripped endlessly from his face, and even breathing became painfully difficult. Unable to resist the fear any longer, he finally broke down completely. With his voice shaking and his words barely coming out, Delkin stuttered that he was wrong. He then confessed in terror that both he and his son had dared to try to harm young Master Clem at the same time. The horrifying power behind Clem's voice had finally forced the truth out of him. That power was originally a voice used to summon the souls of the dead. Known as the dead man's voice, it was a Necromancer exclusive technique that disturbed the soul itself, a chilling ability capable of driving the living into overwhelming fear. Delkin Cornwell completely collapsed in front of Clem. Trembling uncontrollably, he dropped to his knees and bowed his head low, begging for forgiveness. Then he confessed even further, admitting that he had insulted the young master's mother, Grand Duchess Claire. He pleaded desperately for forgiveness, while the people watching could barely believe the sight before them. One spectator stared with a stunned expression and muttered that this could not be real, shocked that a pillar of the Branch family could crumble so completely in public. Meanwhile, Clem slowly lifted his shattered sword toward the sky. Even though the blade was broken, the pressure around him only seemed to grow stronger, making everyone instinctively focus on him. Then, in front of every person gathered there, Cleanse began speaking with absolute confidence. He said this was where everything would begin, and his voice echoed across the battlefield, drawing every gaze toward him. Everyone present fell silent as he declared his existence before them. He announced that in order to set this family right, he stood as the challenger of this trial by combat, and as its rightful victor. His eyes remained steady, his posture unwavering, as he continued speaking before the crowd. He declared himself the son of Grand Duchess Claire Ladalasis and the second son of the North's strongest knight, Heinkel Rhineland. Then, with pride and certainty in his voice, he gave his name before everyone present. He was Cleanse Rhineland. After that powerful declaration, the scene shifted to an entirely different place. The atmosphere there was much calmer, but also heavier in a solemn, almost sacred way, as if every sound in the space carried the weight of faith and judgment. A man entered a quiet hall, and nearby, a priest could be seen praying softly. The priest spoke of going to a place where God's light could not reach. Even if that path was dangerous, even if it was filled with pain, he prayed that the God of light would still watch over their intentions. Just then, the man who had entered the hall stepped forward, his presence breaking through the quiet prayer. He addressed the priest as Cardinal Murak, and the priest slowly turned toward him before answering him by name, calling him Garrison. Cardinal Murak noticed the grim tone in Garrison's voice and asked what was wrong. Garrison's expression remained severe as he answered without delay, saying that the surveillance target had been attacked, and that the attackers were a necromancer and his undead. A brief silence settled over the room before Garrison firmly added that he needed to confirm it personally. But Cardinal Murak showed no concern at all. Instead, Cardinal Murak replied with disturbing calm, saying there was no need to worry because everything had been part of the plan from the beginning. He explained that the Necromancer had been dispatched in cooperation with the Empire. Garrison's eyes narrowed slightly as Cardinal Murak continued, as if it were perfectly reasonable. A Necromancer, he said, was an existence that naturally inspired fear, and those frightened by such a sight would inevitably seek God. According to him, countless people would then gather under the Holy Order. As he said this, his voice grew even colder, stripped of any true compassion. Cardinal Murak told Garrison to understand that if the Holy Order could be revived and God's will could be spread through only a handful of sacrifices, then it was worth it. But before he could finish saying any more, Garrison suddenly moved. In an instant, Garrison seized Cardinal Murak by the throat with overwhelming force, his hand closing around him like an iron clamp. His eyes burned with fury as he spoke through clenched teeth, accusing a servant of the Holy Temple of falling into petty political games and making deals with heretics. Then, in the very next moment, Garrison used nothing but raw strength to crush the cardinal's head completely. Blood burst across the surroundings as Cardinal Murak's body lost all strength and collapsed lifelessly onto the floor. Right after that brutal scene, another voice suddenly echoed through the hall, cutting through the silence left behind. The voice asked if Garrison felt any better now. A man slowly stepped forward through the blood-stained hall, looking directly at Garrison with a calm expression and a tone that carried a trace of mockery. He said Garrison Veerman had not changed at all, then remarked that Garrison had killed more clergymen than the necromancers themselves. A faint smile appeared on his face as he continued speaking. He added that the people of the Holy Order really ought to know what Garrison was hiding inside that body of his. The man standing there was none other than Palaminel, the Archbishop of the Holy Order. After hearing those words, Garrison glared at him with cold, hostile eyes and asked whether this had been Palaminel's doing. Palamin answered without the slightest hesitation, saying of course it had not been his doing. He had merely authorized it. Then his expression shifted, becoming far more serious than before. Besides, Palamin added, he had brought a certain piece of information concerning Garrison's surveillance target. The moment those words left his mouth, Garrison's gaze sharpened, and without the slightest hesitation, he moved to attack Palamin as well. Garrison's fist shot forward with terrifying force, carrying enough power to kill an ordinary man on the spot. But Palamin's movements were far beyond anything a normal person could follow. Before Garrison could even fully grasp what had happened, Palamin had already vanished from directly in front of him and reappeared in another spot, avoiding the deadly strike as if it were nothing. Then, without even losing his calm tone, Palamin continued speaking, saying that whenever necromancy was used, it always left traces behind. As he spoke, Palamon lifted a strange cross-shaped object into view and explained that this cross contained those very traces. It had belonged to the necromancer Garrison had killed. Garrison's expression hardened as he listened in silence, and Palamon went on. One of the traces came from soul-returning arts, a kind of necromancy that raised corpses, something the Empire was actively researching. But then Palamon's voice lowered slightly as he added that the other trace was different. That one resembled the original form of necromancy, a power that manipulated souls rather than simply controlling corpses. Garrison reacted immediately to those words, repeating the phrase with a cold, cautious look in his eyes. The original form of necromancy. Palamon answered him without hesitation and confirmed it. The atmosphere in the hall suddenly grew much heavier. Palamon calmly explained that this meant there had not been only one necromancer at the scene. There had been two. Then Palamon looked straight into Garrison's eyes, his voice slowing down as if he wanted every single word to sink in clearly. He told Garrison to listen carefully, because the person involved was none other than his surveillance target. After a brief, tense silence, Palamon revealed the name. The second son of the Rhineland family, Cleanse Rhineland, was a necromancer. After that shocking revelation, the scene shifted to a light drizzle falling quietly from the sky. Deep inside a dark cave, a faint glow flickered from within the shadows. Inside that cave, someone was working alone, mining in the dim light with no one else nearby. The sharp sound of metal striking stone echoed through the tunnel again and again. After a while, the miner finally paused and slowly straightened his back to catch his breath. But the moment he turned around, a terrifying devilish hand suddenly emerged from the darkness right behind him. Before the man could even understand what was happening, the creature lunged from behind and attacked him in an instant. The scene then shifted to Little Maid, who stood there with a deeply troubled look on her face as she stared at what she had made. With an embarrassed expression, she muttered that this was a disaster. She had somehow ended up making a doll with the young master's face. And the worst part was that it looked exactly like him. Even as she said that, there was a strange little pride mixed into her awkward smile. Right in front of her, Cleanse sat calmly going through a stack of documents, barely paying any attention to her reaction. By then, a full week had already passed since the trial by combat. Cleanse had defeated Randall, the champion chosen for the duel, using the Rhineland family's own technique. After that, he had forced Count Cornwell's confession with the dead man's voice and publicly declared his existence in front of the entire Branch family faction. Because of all that, Cleanse had thought that maybe, at last, everyone would finally begin to acknowledge him. But his face soon showed exhaustion as reality caught up with him. The real problem was that this 15-year-old body still lacked the stamina to keep up with everything he needed to do. Cleanse then glanced toward Little Maid with an annoyed look and told her that if she was done playing around, she should hurry back to her room and sleep. Little Maid immediately puffed out her cheeks and complained that he was being mean, saying that he always played by himself. Cleanse stared at her in disbelief and shot back, asking what she meant by playing when he was clearly reading. Little Maid crossed her arms and argued back without hesitation, saying it was just a novel anyway. So in the end, he was basically playing too. The cover may have looked like an ordinary novel, but the contents were completely different. Hidden inside were Cleanse's secret notes on anatomy, magic circuits, and spell formations. Every single part of it was connected to necromancy. As Cleanse quietly drank his tea, his thoughts continued moving. With his current body, he could summon 11 skeletons at most. His control over them was stable, but the number was still too small for a long battle of attrition. If he wanted to go further, he would need to continue researching. Then his expression slowly darkened as another problem came to mind. The biggest threat was that damned priest. The man looked like the type who would exterminate even the smallest seed of a necromancer without hesitation. Since he was already suspicious of Cleanse had to regain his original power somehow before the priest came looking for him. The question was how to do that without letting everyone else notice. Right after that, the scene shifted to his father, who appeared to be discussing an urgent matter. With a serious look, he said they had received reports of sightings at the mine. Those creatures were commonly known as undead. The moment Cleanse heard that word, his eyes sharpened at once, and inside his mind, he knew this was exactly what he had been waiting for. Without wasting even a second, Cleanse told his father that he would go. At the same time, another thought passed through his mind. Real combat would be the best possible form of research. Hearing Cleanse make that decision so quickly, his father looked slightly concerned and reminded him that there had already been reports of casualties. Then he asked whether Cleanse would truly be all right. Cleanse answered calmly that it would not be a problem, but deep down, he was thinking further ahead. After the trial by combat, even Heinkel had acknowledged him. And if undead were involved, then this incident was likely connected to the one that had attacked him before. To Cleanse, this was not just a mission. It was an opportunity. The scene then shifted to the mission site, where a knight stood respectfully at Cleanse's side and said that the Duke had ordered him to accompany the young master for his safety. Hearing that, Cleanse silently thought that he should have expected as much. Meanwhile, the knight standing in front of him looked surprisingly relaxed despite the mission, and cheerfully commented that the night sky looked amazing while they were out on duty. A moment later, the knight offered Cleanse a freshly prepared dish and told him to eat it while it was still hot. Cleanse answered immediately and calmly refused. Even so, the knight did not give up. Looking awkward, he tried to insist that, as someone sent along on the mission, he should at least be allowed to do some work. Cleanse glanced toward the completely burnt lump sitting near the fire, then responded coldly by asking if the knight could not see that piece of charcoal right there. Then he added that the knight staying still was already the best help he could offer. During this mission, Cleanse had learned one unexpected fact. Dunkel, despite being a supposed knight commander, was completely useless when it came to things like cooking or hunting. Hearing that, Dunkel only gave an embarrassed smile, lowered his head slightly, and admitted that he had no face to show the young master. Dunkel said he did not even know what to say. Cleanse let out a small sigh, then told him to forget about it, just eat for now, and he would grill some more in a bit. At the same time, another thought passed through Cleanse's mind. After spending more than a decade running from the Allied Knight Orders, this much was nothing to him. After that, the atmosphere around the campfire slowly settled into something calmer. The flames crackled softly in front of them, while the dark night stretched endlessly overhead, quiet and wide above the mission camp. It was then that Dunkel suddenly spoke in a more serious voice. He said that whenever he watched Cleanse, he felt the young master was very different from others his age. During the trial by combat, Cleanse had hidden both his sword talent and his spirit far too well. Dunkel paused for a moment, choosing his next words carefully. Because of that, Dunkel admitted that sometimes he almost wondered whether Cleanse might actually be the reincarnation of Asha'man. The instant that name was spoken, Cleanse's expression changed completely. Cleanse immediately turned his gaze toward Dunkel and warned him coldly to never say that in front of that priest. Dunkel quickly raised both hands in panic and hurriedly answered that of course he would never do that. After all, Asha'man was known as the demon who had turned tens of millions of northerners into undead. The moment those words left Dunkel's mouth, the campfire in front of them suddenly flared up violently. The flames swelled far higher than before, growing fierce and wild as the crackling sounds grew louder and heat spread sharply through the area. Only moments earlier, the surroundings had been calm and quiet beneath the dark evening sky. So when the fire changed so suddenly, Dunkel was immediately startled, his attention snapping straight toward the flames. Seeing the fire suddenly swell in front of them, Cleanse slowly lifted his head, and the calm look he had been wearing moments earlier began to disappear. His face was now filled with clear anger, and his voice turned cold as he warned Dunkel never, under any circumstances, to speak about that matter again. Dunkel froze in place, completely confused and alarmed by how sharply Cleanse had reacted. He cautiously called out to the young master, unsure whether he had said something he should never have touched. But before either of them could continue the conversation, loud screams suddenly rang out from behind them. Both of them immediately turned toward the noise, only to see a horrifying corpse-like creature crawling out from the darkness. Inside the village, chaos had already erupted in every direction. The streets were filled with terrified people running for their lives, and desperate screams echoed everywhere as the villagers shouted that the undead had appeared and begged everyone to run. Countless undead creatures chased after the villagers with terrifying speed. Their twisted bodies moved in unnatural, jerking motions as they attacked anyone unlucky enough to be within reach. At that very moment, Dunkel arrived at the scene. The instant Dunkel entered the village, he swung his sword with overwhelming force and cut down several undead monsters at once. His blade moved so fast that the creatures barely had a chance to react before they were torn apart. He kept charging forward without slowing down, cutting through monster after monster as he pushed deeper into the village. After advancing far ahead, Dunkel suddenly turned back and shouted for the young master. But behind him, Cleanse was already moving through the battlefield on his own, calmly eliminating every undead creature left in his path. While the villagers screamed in panic all around him, his expression stayed cold and steady. As he cut down the undead one after another, Cleanse spoke in an icy voice, asking Dunkel what he was doing and ordering him to go save the people instead of worrying about him. Hearing that command, Dunkel immediately straightened his posture and answered loudly. Soon after, the two of them worked together, completely overpowering the undead that had invaded the village. One by one, every monster in the village was destroyed, and the terrified villagers who had been trapped in the disaster were finally rescued from danger. As the atmosphere slowly settled, the surviving villagers gathered together, still shaken and unable to believe they had made it out alive. One villager stepped forward with gratitude mixed with confusion and thanked them for helping, then asked who they were. Dunkel proudly answered that the person before them was the second young master of the Rhineland family. The moment the villagers heard that name, their eyes widened in shock, and the air around them changed as they stared at Cleanse with disbelief and surprise. But Dunkel quickly pulled the conversation back to the urgent matter at hand. With a serious look, he asked when those creatures had first started appearing. Meanwhile, Cleanse quietly examined the undead corpses scattered across the village. After looking them over carefully, he calmly concluded that this was a form of reanimation magic used to revive and control dead bodies. His eyes narrowed as the realization settled in. As expected, it was the same kind of technique as the one that had attacked him in the forest before. Right after that, one of the villagers stepped forward and hurriedly explained that it had started 2 months ago. It happened right after the Count's family restricted access to the mine, and around that same time, people began disappearing. His voice trembled with both fear and anger as he continued speaking. Then he revealed that those undead were not strangers or random corpses. They were all residents of their village. The moment Cleanse heard that, his expression changed instantly, shock flashing across his face as he slowly turned back and asked what the villager had just said. But before anything else could happen, another man suddenly grabbed Cleanse tightly by the clothes and shouted in his face, demanding to know whether he was truly a Rhineland. Seeing the man grab Cleanse so aggressively, Dunkel immediately stepped forward in anger and shouted at him, asking what he thought he was doing to the young master. Dunkel forcefully pulled the villager back, trying to separate him from Cleanse. But even then, the man kept screaming in desperation. He shouted that they had begged for help for 2 whole months and never received a single reply, yet now only 2 people had appeared just to ask when it had started. As he spoke, his voice began to break, with tears and rage mixing together. Then he pointed toward one of the corpses lying nearby and shouted that the person they had just cut down was his father. It was the same miner who had been seen at the beginning, the man who had simply spent his days working at the mine. The villager kept shouting through his pain, saying that his father had done nothing except work day and night. Then, with his grief spilling out, he demanded to know why they had to suffer through something so cruel. Meanwhile, Cleanse stood silently in front of him, saying nothing as countless thoughts moved through his mind. The name Ashimon echoed inside his head again and again, and his expression slowly darkened. It was clear that anger was beginning to rise inside him. Finally, Cleanse looked at the villager with cold eyes and spoke in an irritated voice, telling him he was too loud and to shut up. Then he asked why any of this should be blamed on him. He continued coldly, saying that he was not the one who had turned the man's father and the others into undead. If the villager wanted to release his anger, then he needed to choose the right target instead of lashing out at the wrong person. The moment Cleanse said that, flames slowly began to rise from his hand, casting a glow across the dark surroundings. Seeing this, Dunkel hurriedly stepped forward and said he would handle things here, but before he could finish, Cleanse had already begun chanting in a solemn voice. Cleanse commanded the innocent spirits who had died in sorrow, and the atmosphere around the village instantly grew heavy. Dunkel stared at him in complete shock as the chant continued. Cleanse declared that he would light the guide's lantern to illuminate their path. His voice echoed through the silent village while the flames around him flickered in an unnatural rhythm. Then he stated that he, Cleanse Rhineland, would uphold their will. Raising his glowing hand slightly forward, he commanded the spirits to follow his guidance. At that very moment, an unbelievable sight unfolded before everyone's eyes. Blue souls slowly began rising from inside the undead bodies scattered across the village, one after another. The spirits that had been trapped inside those corpses were finally breaking free. The glowing souls floated quietly into the air, looking down toward their own lifeless bodies lying below them. Cleanse was using his own ability to perform all of this. The liberated spirits began speaking softly among themselves, but the language they used was one that only Cleanse could understand. After listening carefully for a moment, Cleanse quietly answered them, saying that he understood. The villagers watching the scene were left completely speechless. Shock and disbelief covered every face as they stared at the souls rising before them. Then one person suddenly spoke in astonishment, recognizing it as a technique said to have been used 200 years ago during the plague in the north, a technique meant to liberate the dead. Meanwhile, the same villager who had blamed Cleanse earlier slowly turned his gaze toward his father's spirit. The old man's spirit turned back toward Cleanse, then toward his son. With a gentle smile on his face, the old man looked at his son one last time before his soul slowly drifted away together with the others. Right after that, one of the spirits pointed toward the mountains and said that the mine was in that direction. The spirit explained that if they followed the mountain path straight upward, they would reach it. Later, while following behind Cleanse, Dunkel finally broke the silence and asked what Cleanse had talked about with the spirits earlier. Cleanse answered calmly, saying it had been nothing important. He said the spirits had simply thanked him for helping them pass on. But after a brief pause, his expression darkened slightly, and he added that they had also begged him to take revenge. Dunkel quietly repeated the word, revenge, as if that single word had struck something deep inside him. At that instant, memories from earlier flashed through Dunkel's mind. He remembered asking whether Cleanse might truly be the reincarnation of Ashimon, and he remembered Cleanse's angry warning never to speak of that matter again. The suspicion in Dunkel's heart only grew stronger. Suddenly, Dunkel drew his sword and placed the blade directly against Cleanse's neck. His voice turned cold as he asked Cleanse exactly who he really was. After that, the story shifted into the past. Inside the grand estate, anxious voices filled the halls as people whispered among themselves in fear and disbelief, asking whether that boy was truly Lord Cleanse Rhineland. The young master who had been confined inside the monastery for 7 long years had finally returned to the estate. People whispered fearfully that he was the cursed young master who called himself Ashimon. But what truly unsettled everyone was not simply the fact that he had come back. It was the look in his eyes. His pitch-black gaze was so hollow, so completely empty, that no one could easily believe those eyes belonged to a child. Anyone who met that stare felt a strange chill crawl down their spine without knowing why. And perhaps, everything really did begin on that very day. The first dead cat was discovered inside the estate's kitchen, lying cold and lifeless where servants passed through every day. The second one was later found in the backyard garden. Then, as if the nightmare were repeating itself, another dead cat appeared the very next day. One after another, the bodies continued to appear around the estate until the number finally reached 7. 7 dead cats had been found throughout the estate, and fear quickly spread among the servants and nobles. Some whispered that Cleanse had used necromancy the moment he was born. Others claimed his mother's bloodline had always been connected to dark magic. Someone else muttered that he had called himself Ashimon, and that the rumors must have been true all along. Before long, nearly everyone in the estate had begun suspecting the same person. Yet even with the tension growing around him and those terrifying rumors closing in, the young master himself showed no reaction. Ever since his return to the estate, Cleanse had done nothing but sit quietly and stare out the window, as though the whispers around him meant absolutely nothing. Nearby, one of the knights lowered his voice and spoke. The knight said that although everyone suspected the young master of being Ashimon, Cleanse was still far too young. In his eyes, a child like that probably had nothing to do with the strange incidents happening in the estate. That night, when the entire estate was buried under the darkness of midnight, Dunkel suddenly noticed someone walking alone through the silent halls. He realized it was the young master and wondered where Cleanse could possibly be going at such an hour. But Cleanse did not stop, answer, or even look back. Without saying a single word, Cleanse simply continued walking forward, his small figure disappearing deeper into the darkness of the corridor. Feeling uneasy, Dunkel quietly followed behind him, keeping enough distance so Cleanse would not immediately notice he was there. After following him for some time, Cleanse finally arrived somewhere that made Dunkel freeze in surprise. It was the cemetery. Dunkel stared ahead in confusion, unable to understand why the young master would come to a place like this in the middle of the night. The moonlight barely slipped through the rows of old tombstones, leaving most of the area swallowed by shadow. Dunkel could not see clearly because of the gravestones blocking his view, so he wondered whether he should move closer and check. Carefully, Dunkel stepped forward between the tombstones, moving quietly through the cold cemetery until he finally got a clear look at the young master. And the moment Dunkel saw what was in front of him, his eyes widened in complete shock as he wondered what in the world he was looking at. There, surrounded by the dead cats, stood young Master Cleanse. He seemed to be quietly preparing something beside their small, lifeless bodies. When he heard Dunkel's voice, Cleanse slowly turned around and looked back at him with those same dark, emotionless eyes. Then, in a calm and quiet voice, Cleanse said that he was going to perform funeral rites for them now. Dunkel stared at him in confusion, still unable to process the scene before him, and repeated the words back in disbelief. Funeral rites? Cleanse quietly lowered his gaze toward the dead cats in front of him and explained that judging from the lesions, they had died from an infectious disease. It was harmless to humans, but deadly to animals. He continued that if those bodies were simply left there, the disease would keep spreading. Other beasts might even dig them up, which would only make the situation worse. Hearing that, Dunkel's expression changed slightly. For a moment, he simply watched the young master kneeling there in the cold cemetery at midnight, personally handling infected corpses with his own hands. Worried, Dunkel said that Cleanse would ruin his hands and suggested calling someone else to take care of it. But Cleanse slowly shook his head. In the same calm, almost emotionless voice, he said that someone had to do it anyway. Yet despite how flat his tone was, there was something strangely sincere in his words. It was a job that someone had to do, and with those words, that memory from the past slowly came to an end. The scene returned to the present, where the atmosphere had become unbearably tense. Dunkel stood directly in front of Cleanse with his sword pressed against his neck. Suspicion, hesitation, and confusion mixed in his sharp eyes as he demanded to know who Cleanse really was. After hearing that question, young Master Cleanse stayed completely calm. Instead of answering right away, he quietly looked at Dunkel and asked him something first. Did he remember the very first saying of Berkel Rhineland? Dunkel answered without the slightest hesitation, as if those words had been carved into his heart long ago. It was one's actions, not their roots, that defined a being. Cleanse gave a faint nod and said that was exactly right. Then he continued slowly, saying those words were the reason Dunkel, a poor peasant, had been able to rise and become captain of the knights. They were also the reason Cleanse, the son of a foreign mother, was still alive today. The silence between them grew heavier with every word. Cleanse then said that ever since he had left the monastery, the person who had spent the most time by his side was Dunkel. He looked straight into Dunkel's eyes and told him to decide for himself. If Dunkel truly believed that Cleanse was Ashimon, then he should strike him down right there. The moment those words were spoken, the tension in the air became almost suffocating. Dunkel's sword stayed pressed in place for several long seconds. Then, at last, he slowly lowered the blade. Even so, the doubt in Dunkel's eyes had not completely vanished. He said firmly that he still had not made up his mind, and he was certainly not convinced. His grip tightened around the sword as his voice turned cold again. However, the one he served was the second young master of Rhineland, Cleanse, not some atrocious devil feared across the entire continent. After hearing Dunkel's answer, Cleanse quietly turned his head and looked into the deeper darkness ahead of them. Then he calmly said they needed to keep moving forward. The two of them continued farther into the underground passage, and with every step, the air around them grew colder and heavier, as if death itself was filling the tunnel. Inside his mind, Cleanse silently thought that he understood, and took Dunkel's words almost like a compliment. As they moved deeper, the darkness around them thickened until they could barely see what lay ahead. Realizing this, Dunkel lit a torch. Orange flames flickered against the rough stone walls, and at last, the light revealed the horrifying sight hidden inside the darkness. The air reeked of corpses. Scattered all around them were countless dead bodies, and to be more precise, many had already decayed until only skeletons remained. Bones lay piled across the ground in every direction, turning the underground chamber into an eerie and disturbing scene. But then, Dunkel suddenly noticed movement somewhere ahead of them. Some of the corpses in front of them were slowly beginning to move. The moment Dunkel realized it, his expression hardened and his body tensed for battle. He counted 7 of them at first glance, but there had to be more lurking deeper inside. At that moment, Cleanse calmly stepped forward and began chanting in a cold, steady voice. He called upon them and ordered them to answer. Then his voice echoed through the dark chamber again as he declared that he would grant them flesh to crush their enemies. The instant Cleanse finished those words, the skeletons scattered across the ground suddenly reacted. One after another, the undead bodies rose from the floor and rushed straight toward the enemies waiting ahead. Dunkel's eyes widened in total shock as the battle erupted right before him without warning. Inside the narrow underground chamber, the undead creatures crashed violently into one another. Bones shattered, weapons slammed together, and terrifying growls echoed through the darkness as the corpses tore into each other in a brutal clash. Watching it all unfold, Dunkel could hardly believe what he was seeing. He muttered that it made no sense and wondered whether skeletons like that truly existed. Cleanse glanced at him and calmly said that Dalton's mercenaries had reacted the same way. Then, with the slightest hint of amusement in his voice, he asked if it was really that fascinating. Not long after, the battle finally ended. The remaining undead collapsed onto the ground one after another, their bodies crumbling apart as silence gradually returned to the chamber. Dunkel immediately stepped forward and raised the torch higher, letting the light stretch farther into the darkness ahead. Then he called to the young master and pointed out the way forward. As horrifying sounds echoed from deeper within the underground ruins, Dunkel tightened his grip around his sword and carefully listened to the movements waiting ahead. Judging from the noise echoing through the ruins, there had to be around 40 of them closing in. Dunkel's face immediately tightened, and as the distant rattling grew louder, the situation became painfully clear to him. They were completely outnumbered. But unlike Dunkel, Cleanse did not show even the smallest sign of fear. His expression stayed cold and composed, as if he had already expected this. Then he slowly lifted one hand into the air and began chanting again, his voice low, firm, and filled with command. I release the bindings that shroud your bodies. In an instant, the air around them sank into a suffocating pressure, and dark energy began spreading across the battlefield like black mist. Free your souls bound in agony, and obey my command. The moment those words left Cleanse's mouth, the same terrifying scene from before repeated itself. The undead bodies that had already been defeated and left scattered across the ground suddenly twitched, then slowly began to rise again under his control. Dunkel stared at the scene with his eyes wide open, unable to hide his shock. Young master, is this? Without taking his gaze away from the enemies ahead, Cleanse answered in the same calm tone, converting subdued undead into allies. He said it so naturally, almost as if this horrifying sight was nothing more than a common battlefield method. It's a basic tactic when necromancers fight each other. After saying that, Cleanse shifted his eyes toward the undead that were now gathering beneath his command, watching their numbers steadily grow around him. Once the revived undead had lined up under his control, Cleanse quietly muttered, well, this should be enough to put up a fight. Then, without wasting even a second, He raised his voice and gave the next order. Vanguard, charge forward. The skeleton soldiers instantly surged ahead, moving like disciplined warriors who had just received orders from a seasoned commander. Uncle, we're running too. With that, Cleanse and Dunkel immediately moved after them, following behind the undead army as it pushed forward into the darkness. As they advanced deeper into the underground ruins, more undead creatures began emerging from the shadows ahead, one after another, as if the darkness itself was spilling them out. Rotten corpses with twisted limbs and skeletal figures clutching old weapons poured into the narrow passageways from every direction, flooding the ruins with a grotesque, suffocating wave of death. Even with enemies swarming in from all sides, Clean's undead army did not stop for a moment. The skeletons under his command crashed straight into the hostile undead, cutting into their formation with frightening coordination. Bones splintered across the stone floor, rusted blades slammed against each other, and the screams of the undead echoed endlessly through the tight underground corridors. Dunkel watched the entire battle unfold right in front of him, and he could barely believe what he was seeing. Rear guard, support the attack. Cleanse continued issuing commands with perfect timing, his voice never shaking once. Keep breaking through. Every skeleton responded without hesitation. They moved exactly as ordered, not like wild monsters, but like trained soldiers on a real battlefield, while Dunkel fought beside them and cut down any undead that slipped through. Even as he swung his sword and pushed forward, Dunkel could not stop the thoughts racing through his head. It's hard to believe this even while watching it happen. He struck down another undead that lunged at him, then continued thinking as his eyes followed the skeleton formation. Skeletons were supposed to be low-tier creatures, weak even among undead. But the scene before him completely overturned that common belief. But they can move like this, just like a real army. The more he watched, the more unreal it all felt. These skeletons were not fighting like empty, mindless monsters. They adjusted their spacing, covered each other's movements, and followed each command with sharp discipline, almost as if they were veteran soldiers being guided by a flawless commander. Before long, the brutal clash finally came to an end. The countless hostile undead that had blocked their path were now scattered across the ruins, completely destroyed and no longer moving. As silence slowly settled over the underground ruins again, Dunkel stood among the broken bones and mutilated corpses, staring at the destruction in disbelief. We annihilated a force more than 4 times our size. Even after seeing it happen with his own eyes, he still could not fully accept it. What in the world is this? But Cleanse only looked deeper into the darkness ahead, his expression unchanged, before calmly saying, "From here on out, it's just the two of us." Cleanse continued speaking in that same steady voice as the two of them moved farther into the underground ruins. "You said you would believe in me." His eyes remained fixed on the darkness stretching ahead of them, and then he added quietly, but with absolute firmness, "Then believe in me until the very end." Dunkel walked beside him in silence for a while, carefully scanning the walls, the ceiling, and the passage ahead. Eventually, he spoke again in a low voice. "It seems we've come quite deep already. How much farther do we need to go?" But before Cleanse had a chance to answer, something dropped from above. A single bead of blood fell through the darkness and landed directly on Dunkel's face. Dunkel's expression hardened instantly. He slowly raised his torch toward the ceiling ahead, his grip tightening as he took a cautious step forward into the gloom. "There's someone here." But the very moment the torchlight reached the space above them, Dunkel froze where he stood, horror spreading across his face. Dozens of dead bodies were hanging from ropes overhead. Their lifeless forms swayed faintly in the darkness, while fresh blood dripped from their bodies and splashed onto the cold stone floor below. A thick, nauseating stench of decay filled the chamber so heavily that even breathing became difficult. Dunkel stared up at the gruesome sight, his voice caught between anger and disbelief. "What in the world is all this?" Cleanse quietly studied the hanging corpses, then explained the truth in a calm, emotionless voice. "It looks like these are the villagers who were reported missing." His gaze remained cold as he continued. "They were kidnapped and used as materials for reanimation magic." At that exact moment, another voice suddenly echoed through the chamber. "As expected, you understand it very well." Cleanse and Dunkel both turned immediately toward the direction of the voice. From the darkness ahead, a witch slowly stepped into view. A sinister smile curved across her face as she began to speak. "Reanimation magic is a spell that revives corpses and turns them into one's familiars." She spread her arms slowly, almost proudly, as if the horrific chamber around her was some kind of masterpiece. "That's why it requires a massive quantity of high-quality bodies." Then her eyes settled directly on Cleanse, and her smile grew even wider. "It's basic knowledge among us necromancers, isn't it?" The moment she said that, the air inside the chamber felt even heavier, as if the darkness itself had pressed closer around them. "I never imagined I would meet you in a place like this." Her eyes narrowed as she looked at Cleanse, and then she addressed him with a title that should never have been spoken aloud. "It's been a long time. Devil of the Continent." Then, With chilling certainty, she called him by another name. Lord Ashimon. The moment those words reached Clin's ears, his expression changed completely. For the first time, clear shock surfaced on his face. And right then, everything shifted back into the past. The scene returned to the Rhineland estate. Dunkel stood beside Cleanse, maintaining a respectful posture as he spoke to him. Shall we head straight to his grace, the Duke? After hearing that, Cleanse answered calmly, let me change my clothes first. Dunkel gave a quiet nod, but right at that moment, Cleanse suddenly sensed a strange presence nearby. Cleanse Farrell had once been considered one of the strongest on the continent. Inside his mind, he thought, I thought someone was there. And his instinct had not been wrong. Someone truly had been watching him from nearby. At that very moment, Leia Ren was secretly hiding close by, silently observing everything from the shadows without revealing herself. Then, as the past continued to unfold, one important truth was finally revealed. Necromancer. The origin of that word came from corpse, necros, and divination, mentia. Long ago, the term was used for those who summoned the souls of the dead in order to receive prophecies and oracles. In ancient times, necromancers were feared and treated with caution, but they were not yet regarded as absolute monsters. However, everything changed after one catastrophic day. The entire world was plunged into terror during the disaster that became known across the continent as the Ashimon incident. It was a nightmare beyond anything humanity had ever experienced. Tens of millions of undead suddenly invaded the continent, forming an army that defied all human understanding. They did not need food. They did not need rest. Pain, exhaustion, and even death meant nothing to them. Against such an enemy, ordinary warfare became completely useless. Cities fell one after another. Kingdoms were crushed beneath the endless tide of undead. No matter how many were cut down, more bodies kept rising from the battlefield, swelling the army even further. The entire continent was driven to the edge of ruin as that horrifying undead force devoured everything in its path. And above that nightmare stood one being, Ashimon, the master who commanded the dead. The war finally ended only when the legendary hero, Burkel Rhineland, succeeded in striking Ashimon down. After the catastrophe was over, countless people became obsessed with the terrifying power that necromancy had displayed. One after another, they tried to study those forbidden arts and recreate them for themselves. But in the end, the only thing modern necromancers were truly able to reproduce was reanimation magic. Because of that, the necromancers of the present age had fallen into nothing more than second-rate magicians who simply raised corpses and used them as disposable soldiers, just like the necromancer now standing in front of Cleanse. The scene returned to the present. The red-haired woman took a slow step forward, a mysterious smile still lingering on her lips as she introduced herself with an elegant air. It has been a while, Lord Ashimon. Her crimson eyes rested quietly on Cleanse. I'm pale. A necromancer. The moment she said that, Dunkel's expression changed completely. He could not hide the shock spreading across his face. Ashimon. But before he could even fully process that name, another terrifying detail forced its way into his awareness. Even Cleanse narrowed his eyes slightly. Cleanse sensed the overwhelming power surrounding her and quietly acknowledged it. You're right. His gaze shifted toward the robe she was wearing, studying it closely. It's an incredible amount of mana. After observing her more carefully, he continued in a measured voice. She infused magic directly into her robe. As far as I know, they are the only ones capable of imbuing mana into soft materials. Realizing just how dangerous the woman before them was, Dunkel immediately stepped forward and pointed his sword straight at Pale. You there? His sharp voice rang through the underground chamber. This is young Master Cleanse. His expression hardened with anger as he held his sword firmly between them. Don't you dare call him by the name of scum like Ashimon. For a brief moment, silence filled the room. Then, after noticing Cleanse's reaction, the red-haired woman suddenly smiled mischievously and let out a light laugh. I was only joking. Her tone sounded playful, but the eerie feeling around her did not fade at all. I suppose it was rude toward the young master of Rhineland, but then her smile slowly disappeared, and her voice became much calmer. Still, I do know. Her eyes locked directly onto Cleanse, studying him with obvious interest. The rumors surrounding you? Then her gaze sharpened slightly. And the unfamiliar magic I sensed just now. You are definitely a necromancer just like me, the red-haired woman continued, staring straight at Cleanse as if she had finally discovered something fascinating. But how should I put it? For a necromancer to use a sword. Pale's smile slowly stretched wider, as if the idea itself was so strange and entertaining that she could not help but enjoy it. But before she could say anything more, Dunkel suddenly stepped forward and cut her off, his voice sharp with anger. Stop spouting nonsense and answer the question. His sword stayed aimed directly at her, the tip unwavering. What did you do to those people? His face grew even colder as he shouted again. And who put you up to this? The red-haired necromancer did not bother answering him at all. She acted as if Dunkel's questions had never reached her ears. Instead, she slowly lifted one hand. continuing her own words with unsettling calm. A true necromancer does not rely on tools. At the same time, dark mana began spilling from her body and spreading through the chamber in every direction. We command souls. The air inside the underground chamber instantly turned heavier, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. And control death. The instant Pale released that power, every corpse hanging throughout the chamber suddenly began reacting violently, as if something had awakened inside their dead bodies. The lifeless bodies began twitching in unnatural spasms, while dark magic crawled across their skin and sank into them like a spreading curse. Bones snapped with sickening cracks. Dead flesh twisted and warped out of shape. The entire chamber started trembling under the crushing amount of mana pouring through the air. Dunkel instinctively stepped back, his eyes widening as the horrifying scene unfolded right in front of him. Pale slowly spread both arms, almost as if she were proudly unveiling the greatest work of her life. So let me show you. A terrifying smile crept across her face. The true meaning of necromancy. Then, with her voice dripping with obsession and madness, she declared, "The masterpiece I dedicated my entire life to." At that exact moment, something enormous began pushing its way out from the darkness ahead. The first thing to appear was a gigantic hand, massive enough to make the chamber itself feel smaller. Then huge legs slowly stepped forward, and every footfall sent violent tremors through the underground ruins. The creature was so massive that even the ceiling above seemed barely able to contain its body. Dunkel stared at the monster with disbelief written all over his face. "This is insane." His voice trembled slightly as he continued, "I've never seen anything like this even on the battlefield." The gigantic creature finally revealed its full form from the darkness, a massive one-eyed monster towering over them. Dunkel's eyes widened as the truth struck him. That's definitely a cyclops. Meanwhile, Pale walked gently toward the gigantic monster, approaching it not like a weapon of war, but almost like a beloved pet she had been waiting to see. Her voice became strangely soft and affectionate. "Come here, baby." The enormous cyclops lowered itself slightly toward her, obeying her presence. "I'm so sorry." She placed her hand gently against its massive body. "It must have been difficult holding yourself back this whole time, right?" Then she slowly pointed toward Cleanse and Dunkel standing ahead, and her smile twisted into something horrifying. "I have a favor to ask you." The Cyclops let out a deep, monstrous growl that rolled through the underground ruins. Then, with cold excitement filling her voice, Pale gave the order. "Crush those two into a pulp." The enormous monster immediately launched itself forward, charging straight toward them with terrifying force. Cleanse and Dunkel faced the Cyclops as it rushed in with shocking speed, its massive footsteps shaking the underground chamber so violently that it felt as if an earthquake were tearing the ruins apart. The moment Dunkel saw the Cyclops move, his eyes widened in alarm. It's incredibly fast. The gigantic creature closed the distance between them almost instantly, and the second Dunkel realized the young master was in immediate danger, he shouted at the top of his lungs. "It's dangerous, young master." But at that exact moment, Cleanse suddenly shoved Dunkel away with all the strength he could muster. Dunkel's body was thrown backward across the ground, and in the very next instant, the Cyclops' devastating attack came crashing down directly onto Cleanse instead. The impact erupted through the chamber with terrifying force, shaking the underground ruins as if the stone itself might collapse. Cleanse was blasted far into the distance, his body skidding through the dust before slamming heavily against the cold stone floor. Dust and broken debris scattered everywhere around him, and after taking that attack head-on, Cleanse's condition immediately turned grim. Meanwhile, the gigantic Cyclops slowly stepped forward and stood before him once again, looming over his injured body like a living wall of death. The monster raised its enormous arm high into the air, preparing to crush Cleanse completely before he even had a chance to recover. But before that brutal attack could come down, Dunkel suddenly rushed in and appeared between them. With a furious roar, he swung his sword with every ounce of strength he had, driving the blade straight toward the Cyclops. "Stay away from the young master." The powerful slash struck the monster head-on, and the impact rang out loudly through the underground chamber. Even Cleanse, still injured on the ground, looked momentarily surprised by Dunkel's sudden counterattack. At the same time, Pale watched the battle calmly from a distance, amusement gleaming in her eyes as if she were enjoying a performance. "That was a splendid strike, Mr. Knight." Her smile slowly widened as she praised him in a relaxed voice. "But with that level of talent, you can't even leave a scratch on my masterpiece." Dunkel's expression stiffened the moment he heard her words, because right then, he saw it happen with his own eyes. The Cyclops' injured leg began regenerating, its torn flesh twisting and knitting itself back together until the damage vanished completely, as if his attack had never landed at all. Dunkel stared at the monster in disbelief. Its leg is growing back? For one brief second, a flash of fear crossed his mind. But then his eyes slowly shifted toward Cleanse, who was lying injured behind him. "Doesn't matter." Dunkel tightened his grip around the sword hilt. The young master threw himself into danger to save me. That single thought struck him deeply. With a body that doesn't even possess a trace of mana. He lowered his head slightly, shame weighing heavily over him. I can't believe I actually dared to suspect someone like him of being Asha'man. The guilt in Dunkel's chest grew heavier than ever, pressing down on him harder than the danger in front of him. Meanwhile, the gigantic Cyclops charged toward them once again with monstrous force. Dunkel immediately rushed forward to stop it. He unleashed countless rapid strikes across the monster's massive body, his sword moving faster and faster as sparks burst with every impact. Slash after slash crashed against the Cyclops without mercy. Yet no matter how many times he attacked, it felt completely useless. Even so, Dunkel refused to stop. There is only one way to repay this shame. His breathing grew heavier as he continued fighting with everything he had. I will put my life on the line. Another powerful strike slammed into the monster. And protect the young master. After unleashing attack after attack, a small wound finally appeared on the monster's body. But before Dunkel could even feel a moment of relief, the torn flesh immediately began regenerating again right before his eyes. Within moments, the wound disappeared completely. Dunkel's eyes widened with frustration and disbelief. Damn it! His expression darkened as he watched the monster restore itself yet again. The battle continued, and with every passing moment, the clash grew more intense and more desperate. Even after realizing that the Cyclops possessed terrifying regenerative abilities, Dunkel still refused to back down or give in. He charged forward once again and unleashed several more powerful strikes against the gigantic monster. His sword crashed repeatedly against its massive body, each blow landing with tremendous force. But no matter how many times Dunkel's blade struck the monster, none of his attacks seemed to create any lasting damage at all. The Cyclops simply kept advancing, its huge body moving forward as if nothing in front of it could possibly stop it. Then, in the very next moment, the monster swung one of its enormous arms straight toward Dunkel. Boom! The devastating blow slammed directly into him with terrifying force. Dunkel's body was violently launched across the underground chamber, helpless against the overwhelming power behind the attack. He smashed heavily into the stone wall, the impact cracking through the air before his body collapsed onto the ground. From that single hit, his condition immediately became terrible. Watching Dunkel get thrown aside so easily, the red-haired necromancer slowly curled her lips into a satisfied smile. It truly is beyond my imagination. Her eyes shone with obsession and pride as she gazed at the gigantic creature she had created. Pale was deeply moved, and behind that twisted expression lay the truth of the madness that had consumed her. Her endless obsession with necromancy had swallowed her entire life. Through countless experiments and relentless pursuit of forbidden knowledge far beyond ordinary understanding, her research had eventually pushed past the limits of conventional necromancy itself. And at the end of that path, she had finally succeeded in creating a completely unique variant that no one else could ever replicate. Because of that, Pale believed one thing with absolute certainty. This is innate talent. Her voice trembled with excitement, as if even saying those words filled her with overwhelming emotion. Not even Asha'man himself could create something like this. Her smile twisted with unbearable pride, her arrogance swelling as she looked upon her creation. I have surpassed Asha'man's knowledge. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, the Cyclops slowly lifted Dunkel's battered body into the air with one massive hand, preparing to crush him completely in its grip. But at that exact moment, a calm voice suddenly echoed through the underground chamber. Core connection point. Cleanse slowly walked forward as he spoke, his tone so composed it sounded as though he were explaining something simple. That's the first key to synthesizing a Cyclops. The monster continued holding Dunkel in the air, but Cleanse kept approaching without the slightest fear. The second is the core suture. His eyes remained fixed on the Cyclops, carefully following its massive body. That's why its limbs regenerate even after being cut off. Then he added quietly, it's also the source of its regenerative power. The atmosphere shifted at once. Even Pale's expression gradually stiffened as she listened to him speak. So how do you kill that thing? Cleanse continued in the same calm voice, answering the question himself before anyone else could speak. Attacking its body directly like Dunkel did is pointless. He slowly raised his weapon, his gaze never leaving the monster. All it takes is destroying a single core, and it's over. Pale's eyes widened slightly. Then where exactly is that core? Cleanse answered without hesitation. A Cyclops core never stays in one place. His gaze sharpened, cutting straight through the tension in the chamber, because that single point is directly connected to its death. It constantly moves throughout the body. Cleanse took another steady step forward, his voice still controlled, just like blood flowing through veins. The moment those words were spoken, Pale's confident expression finally began to crack. That's impossible, she shouted, finding it is impossible because it never stops moving. Then she desperately pointed toward her masterpiece again. And didn't you hear what I said earlier? Her voice grew louder and more unstable with every word. This is the masterpiece I devoted my entire life to creating. She stretched out her hand and gave another order, her voice now filled with clear killing intent. In the face of true talent, you are nothing. Then she screamed toward the Cyclops, crush him. At that very moment, Cleanse quietly closed his eyes for a brief second, as if shutting out everything around him. Memories from his previous life flashed through his mind. He remembered slaughtering thousands upon thousands of Cyclopes across countless battlefields, and the sensation was still so vivid it felt as if it had happened only yesterday. All he needed to do now was trust those instincts once again. Then, in a single instant, Cleanse moved. A sharp flash sliced through the darkness before anyone could even follow his motion. Before Pale or the monster could react, his attack pierced directly through the Cyclops' constantly moving core with absolute precision. Crack! The core shattered completely. The gigantic monster suddenly froze in place. Then its massive body began breaking apart piece by piece, collapsing heavily before crashing lifelessly onto the ground. Silence fell over the underground chamber. Pale stared at the destroyed Cyclops in complete disbelief. What exactly are you? Her voice trembled, and for the first time, fear appeared clearly on her face. Cleanse looked at her calmly and answered in a cold voice. If this is what you devoted your entire life to creating. His eyes remained completely emotionless, without even the slightest trace of pity. Then perhaps you should make it a hobby in your next life.